Welcome, dear listener, to a tale of darkness, suffering, and the long road to redemption or damnation. Tonight, we delve into one of the most compelling narratives in gaming history, the complete story of Astarion Ancunín, the vampire spawn whose tormented past shapes every word he speaks, every choice he makes, and every breath he no longer needs to take. This is a story best told in the quiet hours, when the world sleeps and shadows grow long, for it is in darkness that Astarion has spent the last 200 years of his undead existence. In the world of Baldur's Gate 3, developed by Larian Studios and set in the Dungeons & Dragons universe of Faerun, players encounter a diverse cast of companions, each carrying their own burdens, secrets, and traumas. Among them walks Astarion, a high elf with pale skin, striking red eyes, and silver hair that catches the moonlight. At first glance, he appears to be everything one might expect from a roguish character: charming, witty, perhaps a bit vain, with a tongue as sharp as the daggers he wields. He's quick with a joke, faster with a cutting remark, and seemingly unbothered by the weight of the world. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lies a story of such profound suffering and cruelty that it shapes every aspect of his being. Astarion is not merely a vampire in the traditional sense. He is a vampire spawn, a crucial distinction in the lore of Dungeons & Dragons, and one that defines the tragedy of his existence. Unlike true vampires, who possess significant power, autonomy, and the ability to create spawn of their own, vampire spawn are thralls, servants bound by supernatural compulsion to their vampire master. They possess many of the traits associated with vampirism: the need to drink blood, sensitivity to sunlight, immunity to aging, enhanced physical abilities, and eternal life. Yet they are slaves in every meaningful sense, incapable of disobeying their master's commands, unable to act against their creator's wishes, bound by chains far stronger than iron or steel. For Astarion, that master was Cazador Szarr, a vampire lord of tremendous power and incomprehensible cruelty. For 200 years, Astarion existed in a state of torment that would break most minds, subject to Cazador's whims, forced to lure victims to their doom, punished with methods so horrific that even now, freed from direct control, Astarion bears scars both physical and psychological that may never fully heal. His story is one of a person stripped of agency, of dignity, of self, reduced to little more than a puppet dancing on strings of blood and dark magic. The world in which this horror unfolds is the Sword Coast region of Faerun, specifically the great city of Baldur's Gate itself. This metropolis stands as one of the most important cities in the Forgotten Realms, a hub of trade, politics, and intrigue where fortunes are made and lost, where the powerful prey upon the weak, and where darkness lurks in alleyways and noble estates alike. Baldur's Gate is a city of contrasts. Grand temples stand blocks away from slums. Wealthy merchants pass beggars without a glance. And beneath the veneer of civilization, corruption runs deep as the roots of ancient trees. It is within this city that Astarion's tale truly begins, though not as a vampire, not even as a victim yet, but as a mortal man, an elf who walked in sunlight without fear, who held a position of authority, and who made choices that would echo through centuries. The city of Baldur's Gate itself becomes almost a character in his story, a place of both origin and return, where his mortal life ended, and where, 200 years later, he would finally confront the source of his torment. Understanding Astarion's story requires understanding the nature of vampirism in Dungeons & Dragons lore. Vampires are undead creatures of considerable power, sustained by blood, cursed with specific vulnerabilities, and possessing abilities that make them formidable predators. The process of creating a vampire is complex, typically involving the death of a victim drained of blood by a vampire, followed by burial and subsequent rising as undead. However, the creation of vampire spawn is more direct and more cruel. A vampire can choose to create spawn rather than full vampires, maintaining absolute control over these lesser undead. The spawn retain their personalities, their memories, their sense of self, but lose their freedom entirely. They become extensions of their master's will, capable of independent thought but incapable of independent action when it contradicts their creator's commands. This is the fate that befell Astarion, and it is important to understand just how absolute this control is. Cazador could command Astarion to do anything at all, and Astarion would be compelled to obey. There is no resisting, no fighting against it. The compulsion is supernatural, woven into the very essence of what a vampire spawn is. If Cazador ordered Astarion to walk into sunlight and burn, Astarion would do so. If Cazador demanded Astarion torture someone he cared for, Astarion would have no choice but to comply. If Cazador wanted Astarion to debase himself in the most humiliating ways imaginable, Astarion could do nothing but obey. For 2 centuries, Astarion was not a person, but a tool, a possession, a slave in the most complete and terrible sense of the word. The psychological impact of such an existence cannot be overstated. Imagine being aware, conscious, fully yourself in terms of thoughts and feelings, yet unable to control your own actions. Imagine being forced to commit atrocities while some part of you screams in protest, unheard and unheeded. Imagine 200 years of this, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, with no hope of escape, no possibility of death, no end in sight. This is the reality Astarion endured, and it shaped him into the person players meet at the beginning of Baldur's Gate 3. A survivor, yes, but a damaged one. Someone whose coping mechanisms include deflection, cruelty, manipulation, and a desperate need for power that might protect him from ever being powerless again. As we settle in to explore Astarion's complete story, we will journey from his origins as a mortal magistrate in Baldur's Gate, through the horrific circumstances of his transformation, into the long nightmare of his servitude to Cazador, and finally to his unexpected liberation and the choices that follow. We will examine not just the events of his undead life, but the themes they represent: trauma and its aftermath, the corrupting nature of power, the long road to healing, and the question of whether someone who has suffered so greatly can truly be saved, or whether the darkness has already consumed too much. This is a story that resonates deeply with players because it touches on fundamental aspects of the human experience, even though its protagonist is no longer human in any conventional sense. It speaks to anyone who has felt powerless, anyone who has survived abuse, anyone who has struggled with questions of identity after trauma, anyone who has wondered whether they can ever truly be free of their past. Astarion's story is dark, often disturbing, but also deeply moving and ultimately about the possibility, however fragile, of reclaiming oneself after being lost for so very long. So settle in, dear listener. Let the world fade around you as we step into the shadows of Baldur's Gate, into a tale 200 years in the making, into the complete story of Astarion Ancunín, the vampire spawn who dared to dream of freedom, who tasted it briefly and beautifully, and who faced an impossible choice between becoming the very thing he hated or remaining forever vulnerable to those who would hurt him. This is his story, told in full, so that you might understand the weight he carries, the choices he makes, and the profound tragedy and hope intertwined in every moment of his existence. Long before Astarion became the vampire spawn known to players of Baldur's Gate 3, he was something entirely different. A mortal high elf living in the great city of Baldur's Gate, walking in sunlight without fear, breathing air into lungs that still functioned, his heart beating with warm blood pumped through living veins. This period of his existence, though it ended over 2 centuries before the events of the game, shaped fundamental aspects of who he would become and provided tragic irony to his later suffering. To understand Astarion completely, we must begin here, in the life that was taken from him, in the choices he made as a mortal that would echo through eternity. Astarion Ancunín was born in the year of the Carrion Crow, 1229 DR, in the Forgotten Realms chronology. He held a position of considerable authority in Baldur's Gate. He was a magistrate, a judge, someone entrusted with upholding the law and dispensing justice. In a city as large and complex as Baldur's Gate, magistrates wielded significant power, determining the fates of those brought before them, interpreting the law, and theoretically serving as a bulwark against chaos and criminality. It was a role that should have been noble, that could have been used to protect the innocent and punish the guilty, that might have made Astarion a force for good in a city that desperately needed such forces. But Baldur's Gate, for all its grandeur, has always been a corrupt place. The city's wealth flows from trade, and where there is wealth, there is the temptation to acquire it by any means necessary. The law itself becomes a commodity, justice something to be bought and sold like any other good in the marketplace. Magistrates and other officials often find themselves presented with opportunities for enrichment, chances to look the other way for the right price, occasions to interpret the law in ways that favor those with full purses over those with empty pockets. The system itself encourages this corruption, and many who enter it with good intentions find those intentions eroded over time by the constant pressure to compromise, to make deals, to accept that this is simply how things are done. The extent of Astarion's corruption as a magistrate remains unclear in the current version of the game. He held the position and made rulings that had consequences, but whether he was deeply corrupt or simply navigating the morally gray waters of Baldur's Gate's legal system is left somewhat ambiguous. What we know for certain is that he made at least one ruling that would prove fateful, a judgment that provoked a violent response from those it affected. During the game's early development, there were suggestions that Astarion may have been more explicitly corrupt, possibly even working with vampires or profiting from his position in darker ways. But this concept appears to have been revised or removed in the final release. The game leaves space for interpretation, allowing players to imagine various degrees of moral compromise in his past. What is clear is that Astarion, by his late 30s in Elven terms, which is quite young for a race that can live for centuries, had established himself in a position of authority. He likely had status, comfort, connections within Baldur's Gate's complex social hierarchy. For a high elf living in the city, this represented a form of success. His future likely seemed secure, a long life of influence stretching ahead of him. Whatever moral compromises he may or may not have made seemed, at the time, to have been worth it, and if his conscience troubled him about his decisions, he had apparently found ways to live with them. Then came the night that changed everything, the night when one of Astarion's rulings as a magistrate caught up with him in the most brutal way imaginable. By the year of Daystars, 1268 DR, when Astarion was 39 years old, he made a judgment, a ruling that went against a group of Gur. The Gur are a nomadic people in the Forgotten Realms, often viewed with suspicion and prejudice by settled folk, and they have their own codes of justice and honor. The specific nature of Astarion's ruling is not detailed in the game, but its consequences were swift and merciless. These Gur, furious at the judgment Astarion had rendered against them or their people, decided to exact their revenge. They tracked him down one night as he walked the streets of Baldur's Gate, likely returning home after his duties, perhaps feeling secure in his position and authority, certainly not expecting what was about to happen. They attacked him, not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, with deliberate cruelty. They beat him savagely, and this was no simple assault meant to rob or frighten. This was punishment, a message, an execution carried out with fists and boots and weapons in a dark alley or street of Baldur's Gate. Astarion was left to die, bleeding out on the cobblestones of the city where he had once held power, his body broken, his blood staining the ground. In those moments, as life ebbed away, what thoughts went through his mind? Did he regret his choices, whether those were rulings he'd made or compromises he'd accepted? Did he think of things left undone, words unsaid, a life cut short far too early by elven standards? Did he feel fear, pain, regret, or anger? We can only speculate, but what we know is that Astarion died that night, died in pain and terror and alone. His mortal life ended not by natural causes or in any dignified manner, but murdered in the street, a victim of the city's violence and the consequences of his own decisions. But death was not the end for Astarion. As he lay dying, someone found him. Not a healer who might save his life, not the city guard who might have called for help, but Cazador Szarr, vampire spawn at the time, soon to become a vampire lord, predator, collector of future spawn. What drew Cazador to that particular dying elf on that particular night raises interesting questions. Was it chance Cazador happening upon the dying victim as he moved through the city? Was it something about Astarion specifically that caught his attention? His appearance, his status, some quality that made him seem like a worthy addition to Cazador's future stable of spawn? Or, more sinisterly, had Cazador somehow orchestrated or known about the attack, positioning himself to arrive at the perfect moment to make his offer? The game leaves this ambiguous, though the timing seems almost too convenient to be pure coincidence, suggesting that Cazador may have been more involved in the circumstances than simple chance would explain. Whatever the reason, Cazador did not leave Astarion to die. Instead, he offered a choice, though calling it a choice is perhaps generous given the circumstances. Astarion, dying, in agony, likely barely conscious, was presented by Cazador with an option: accept immortality through vampirism or die here and now. In that moment, presented with the alternative of final death, bleeding out on the stones, with nothing ahead but oblivion, Astarion agreed. How could he not? Survival instinct overrode any other consideration. He wanted to live, even if he did not understand what living as a vampire spawn truly meant, even if he could not possibly grasp the magnitude of what he was accepting, even if Cazador deliberately obscured the true nature of the bargain. Cazador drained the last of Astarion's blood, completing his death as a mortal being. Then, in the dark ritual of vampire creation, Cazador fed his own blood to Astarion's corpse, binding Astarion to him with chains of blood and dark magic that would prove stronger than any chains of iron. Astarion's body underwent the transformation from mortal to undead, his heart ceasing its beating permanently, his lungs no longer drawing breath, his skin growing cold and pale, his eyes taking on the red tint characteristic of vampire spawn. When Astarion awoke, he found himself not in the alley where he died, but buried in a coffin beneath the earth, forced to claw his way up through soil and darkness, emerging into a night that would last 200 years. When Astarion opened his eyes again, he was no longer the person who had been beaten and left to die. He was something else now, something undead, bound, owned. The irony is profound and bitter. Astarion, who had wielded power over others as a magistrate, who had determined fates and dispensed justice according to his interpretation of law, now found himself completely powerless, subject to another's will in ways far more absolute than any mortal authority could achieve. The man who had been part of a system that could be corrupt and oppressive was now himself oppressed in the most complete way imaginable. There is a dark poetry to this reversal, though whether it constitutes justice or simply more tragedy is a question each observer must answer for themselves. What is clear is that Astarion's mortal life, for all its ambiguities and whatever compromises it may have included, was infinitely preferable to what came after. He had freedom then, even if he used it imperfectly. He had choices, even if those choices sometimes had terrible consequences. He had the possibility of change, of growth, of redemption, or of simply living out his natural elven lifespan. All of that ended the night Cazador found him. The Astarion who was a magistrate died in that alley, and what rose in his place was something trapped, something enslaved, something that would spend the next 200 years yearning for the freedom he had once taken for granted and perhaps not fully appreciated when it was his. This period before the darkness serves as a crucial foundation for understanding everything that follows. It establishes that Astarion's story is not one of pure innocence corrupted, but of a person whose past contains ambiguities facing consequences far exceeding any reasonable scale of justice. It reminds us that victims of abuse and trauma are not always perfect people, that suffering does not discriminate based on prior virtue or vice, that sometimes the cruelest tricks of fate befall those who themselves may have made questionable choices. And it sets up the central tragedy of Astarion's existence, that he learned the value of freedom only after it was stripped away, that he came to understand the horror of powerlessness only by experiencing it for 200 endless years, that the life he lost, imperfect as it was, became in memory something precious beyond measure, a paradise lost that he would spend centuries trying to reclaim. The moment of transformation from mortal to vampire spawn is a threshold, a crossing from one state of being to another, from life to undeath, from freedom to bondage. For Astarion, this transformation began in violence and desperation, in that dark alley of Baldur's Gate, where his mortal blood stained the cobblestones, and it would fundamentally alter every aspect of his existence for the next 2 centuries. To understand the full horror of what Astarion became, we must explore the process of his turning, the immediate aftermath, and his first experiences as a creature of the night, bound in servitude to Cazador Szarr. The process of creating a vampire spawn is different from the creation of a full vampire, and this distinction is crucial to understanding Astarion's predicament. A true vampire is typically created when someone is killed by a vampire's blood drain and then buried, rising from the grave as an independent undead being with significant powers. A vampire spawn, however, is created when a vampire chooses to feed their own blood to a victim, binding that victim to them through the dark magic inherent in vampiric blood. This blood bond is the key to the spawn's eternal servitude, a mystical chain that cannot be broken through any normal means, persisting across any distance, surviving even if the spawn wishes desperately to be free. When Cazador fed his blood to Astarion's dying body, this bond was formed, irrevocable and absolute. The blood carried with it Cazador's will, his essence, his control. It spread through Astarion's still body like dark fire, reanimating dead flesh, altering fundamental aspects of his being at a level deeper than simple physiology. His heart, which had stopped beating, remained still, but he did not need it to pump blood anymore. His lungs ceased their automatic breathing, but breath was now optional rather than necessary. His body temperature dropped to match his surroundings, the warmth of life replaced by the cold of undeath. His very nature changed, shifted, became something that was no longer truly alive, but not precisely dead either, existing in that liminal space that undead creatures occupy. The physical changes were profound. Astarion's already pale elven complexion became even paler, taking on the alabaster quality characteristic of vampires, his skin cool to the touch. His eyes, previously whatever color they had been in life, shifted to red, the crimson tint that marks vampire spawn and their masters. His canine teeth elongated into fangs, retractable but always present, weapons and tools for feeding. His body became stronger, faster, more durable than it had been in mortal life, granted the enhanced physical capabilities that make vampires such effective predators. His senses sharpened, particularly his night vision, allowing him to see in darkness as clearly as mortals see in daylight, though this came at a cost of increased sensitivity to bright light, particularly sunlight. But the most significant change was not physical at all. It was the bond itself, the magical compulsion that now tied Astarion's will to Cazador's. This is difficult for those who have not experienced such a thing to truly comprehend. Imagine that your thoughts remain your own, your personality intact, your sense of self preserved, but the ability to act on your own desires is simply gone when it conflicts with another's commands. The compulsion to obey Cazador was not a matter of fear or coercion in any normal sense. Astarion could not choose to defy an order and accept punishment for that defiance. He literally could not disobey. The command would flow into him, and his body would simply act, regardless of what his mind wanted, regardless of how he felt about it, regardless of any resistance he might try to muster. When Astarion first opened his eyes as a vampire spawn, he found himself in darkness, buried in a coffin beneath the earth. This is where Cazador had left him after the transformation, forcing the newly turned spawn to claw his way up through soil and stone, through several feet of earth, until he finally broke through to the surface. The symbolism of this act suggests that Cazador wanted Astarion's first experience as undead to be one of struggle, isolation, and the understanding that his old life was literally buried. When Astarion finally emerged from his grave, Cazador was simply waiting there, ready to claim his new spawn the moment he resurfaced, making it clear that even this apparent escape was merely part of Cazador's design. The first moments of consciousness as undead must have been profoundly disorienting. The world looked different, smelled different, felt different. The absence of heartbeat, the lack of need to breathe, the strange new hunger that gnawed at him, all of this would have been overwhelming. And standing over him, watching with those ancient eyes, was Cazador, his master, his owner, his tormentor for all the years to come. At this point in 1268 DDR, Cazador was still technically a vampire spawn himself, bound to his own master Veliath, but he already possessed the knowledge and cruelty necessary to completely dominate those he turned. Cazador likely explained, at least to some degree, what Astarion had become, though whether this explanation was cruel or falsely kind we cannot know for certain. The nature of vampire spawn would have been made clear. Astarion was now undead, immortal in the sense that he would not age and could not die from natural causes, but vulnerable to specific weaknesses including sunlight, running water, and the traditional banes of vampire kind. More importantly, Cazador would have established the fundamental rule of Astarion's new existence: obedience, absolute and unquestioning. Cazador imposed specific commands upon his spawn, rules that would govern their existence. The game reveals at least some of these. First, thou shalt not drink of the blood of thinking creatures. Second, thou shalt obey me in all things. Third, thou shalt not leave my side unless directed. Fourth, thou shalt know that thou art mine. These commandments, spoken with the authority of Creator over creation, became more than mere rules. They were supernatural compulsions, woven into the very fabric of what Astarion was, impossible to violate, defining the boundaries of his existence. The first time Cazador gave Astarion a direct command, the nature of the bond would have become horrifyingly apparent. Perhaps it was something simple, an order to bow, to speak certain words, to perform some menial task. Astarion's body would have simply complied, moving without his conscious intention to move, words forming on his lips without his decision to speak them. The realization that he could not control his own actions when Cazador commanded otherwise must have been terrifying, a violation of self so profound that it defies easy description. This was not his body anymore, not really. It was Cazador's instrument, and Astarion was merely a passenger when the master chose to exert control. But in those moments when Cazador did not issue specific commands, Astarion retained agency, at least of a sort. He could think, feel, speak, and act according to his own will, as long as those actions did not violate Cazador's broader commands or standing orders. This created a cruel illusion of freedom, moments when Astarion could almost forget he was a slave, until the next command came and reminded him of the truth. It was perhaps worse than being controlled constantly, because the contrast between those moments of apparent autonomy and the sudden snapping into compelled action emphasized his powerlessness all the more sharply. The hunger was another immediate and pressing concern. Vampire spawn, like true vampires, sustain themselves on blood. They do not strictly need food or water in the traditional sense, though some retain the ability to consume such things for the sake of appearance or taste. But blood is essential, a craving that grows with time, becoming painful and all-consuming, if not satisfied. For Astarion, newly turned, this hunger would have been intense and confusing, his body screaming for something his mind had never desired before, every sense suddenly attuned to the presence of living blood nearby. Cazador controlled even this most basic need. Following his first rule, Astarion was forbidden from drinking the blood of thinking creatures, which meant humanoids. Cazador determined when Astarion could feed, on what he could feed, how much he could take. This control over sustenance was yet another chain, another way Cazador demonstrated his absolute authority over Astarion's existence. Astarion was often forced to feed on rats, vermin, and other degrading sources of blood, kept in a state of constant low-level hunger that weakened him physically and served as a reminder of his degraded status. To deny Astarion adequate blood was to cause him suffering, and Cazador, as we will explore in detail later, was an artist of suffering. The early days of Astarion's existence as a vampire spawn remain somewhat mysterious in their specific details, but we can infer certain things from what is revealed later in the game. He would have been introduced to Cazador's domain, which at this time would have been wherever Cazador was serving his own master, Velioth. He would have met the other spawn that Cazador had already created, for Astarion was not Cazador's first creation. There were others who would eventually become his siblings in undeath. Petras, Deliria, Violet, Leon, Eusin, and Aurelia. Each had their own stories of how Cazador had found them, turned them, bound them to his service. These spawn were not friends, not allies, not even truly fellow victims who might offer comfort and solidarity. They were competitors for Cazador's attention, potential instruments of each other's punishment, and sources of comparison that Cazador could use to pit them against one another. Astarion would have learned the rules, both spoken and unspoken, that governed existence in Cazador's service, where he could go and when, what he could say and to whom, how he was expected to behave, what punishments awaited various infractions. His existence was a maze of such rules, a cage built not just of walls, but of commands and compulsions, each one reinforcing Astarion's lack of freedom, each one reminding him that he was owned, body and will. Perhaps most cruelly, Astarion would have discovered that his turning had not erased his memories or fundamentally changed his personality. He was still himself, still carrying all the thoughts and feelings and experiences of his mortal life, but now trapped in circumstances beyond his control. He remembered sunlight, remembered freedom, remembered the days when his choices were his own, even if those choices had not always led to good outcomes. These memories became a form of torture themselves, a constant reminder of what he had lost, what had been taken from him, what he would never have again unless some miracle freed him from his bondage. The realization of the permanence of his situation must have been one of the most horrific aspects of those early days. Vampire spawn are immortal unless destroyed. Barring violence or accident, Astarion could exist indefinitely in this state, bound to Cazador not for years or even decades, but potentially for centuries, millennia, forever. There was no escape through death, because he was already dead in every meaningful sense. There was no escape through time, because time would change nothing about the fundamental nature of his servitude. There was no hope of Cazador simply releasing him out of kindness or boredom, because even if Cazador had such inclinations, which he decidedly did not, the bond itself could not be broken through normal means. In those early nights, months, perhaps the first few years of his undead existence, Astarion almost certainly tried to resist. The game mentions that during his first decade as a spawn, he attempted to run away, suggesting that he had not yet fully internalized the futility of defiance. This escape attempt would prove to be one of the most traumatic experiences of his entire undead existence. Cazador caught him, and the punishment was severe beyond imagining. Astarion was sealed in a tomb in what Cazador called the kennels, buried alive in darkness for an entire year. Imagine that, 1 full year in darkness, alone, unable to feed, the hunger growing and growing, but never killing, never offering the release of unconsciousness, just constant, gnawing, maddening hunger and the knowledge that you are forgotten, sealed away, perhaps forever. A year for a mortal would be terrible enough, but for an immortal creature, for whom time stretches differently, for whom a year is just the beginning of an eternity, it is a torture almost beyond comprehension. And Astarion survived this, endured it, came out of it still sane, though what it cost him in terms of psychological damage is incalculable. After this experience, Astarion learned that resistance was futile, that escape was impossible, that the only way to survive was to obey and try to find whatever small mercies might exist within his servitude. The transformation from Astarion, the corrupt magistrate, to Astarion, the vampire spawn, was complete. But the transformation from newly turned spawn to the creature that would survive 2 centuries of horror was only beginning. Each night, each command, each feeding on rats and vermin, each punishment, each moment of realization that this was his existence now would chip away at who he had been and shape who he would become. The process of surviving Cazador's slavery would require adaptations, psychological and emotional, that would leave scars perhaps deeper than any physical wound could create. This period of transformation and immediate aftermath represents the death of Astarion's old self, not just physically, but in nearly every other way. The person he had been, with all that person's ambiguities and freedoms, was gone. In its place was something new, something trapped, something that would spend the next 200 years learning what it truly meant to be powerless, what it cost to survive in such circumstances, and what became of the soul when the body was owned by another. This was not rebirth in any positive sense, but a transition into nightmare, the beginning of a horror that would define Astarion's existence for longer than most mortal beings could even comprehend. To understand Astarion's story, one must understand the monster who held him captive for 200 years. Cazador Szarr is not merely a villain in the traditional sense, not simply an antagonist who opposes the protagonists. He is an embodiment of cruelty itself, a creature whose existence is devoted to the domination and torment of others, and whose particular form of evil is all the more terrible for being deliberate, calculated, and savored. Astarion's suffering was not incidental to Cazador's purposes, but central to them, and the vampire lord's character, background, and methods provide essential context for understanding the depth of Astarion's trauma. Cazador Szarr is a vampire lord, meaning he possesses the full powers of vampirism without the limitations that bind vampire spawn. He is not subject to another's will, not compelled to obey, not limited in his autonomy. He is the apex predator, and in the city of Baldur's Gate, he has carved out a position of terrible power, operating from his palace with impunity, feeding on the city's population, and building his collection of spawn for purposes both immediate and long-term. Understanding who Cazador is, where he came from, and what drives him is essential to grasping the full horror of what Astarion endured. Cazador's origins lie in the noble houses of Baldur's Gate, specifically the Szarr family, an ancient lineage with deep roots in the city's history. The Szarr family was once mortal, holding wealth and influence among the patriarch, the noble class that effectively rules Baldur's Gate. But somewhere in the family's history, vampirism entered the bloodline, whether through curse, choice, or circumstance. What is certain is that Cazador himself was not born a vampire, but was turned, made into a vampire spawn by his own master, a vampire known as Velioth the Martinet. This is a crucial detail. Cazador was once in the exact position he would later force upon Astarion and his other spawn. He was bound, compelled, enslaved to Velioth's will, experiencing firsthand the powerlessness and torment of being a vampire spawn. One might think this shared experience would breed empathy, that having suffered such servitude, Cazador might be less inclined to inflict it on others. But the opposite proved true. Cazador's time as a spawn taught him the mechanics of domination, showed him the exquisite control a vampire master possesses over their spawn, and apparently fostered in him a desire not to prevent such suffering, but to be the one inflicting it rather than enduring it. Velioth, known as Velioth the Martinet, was Cazador's master and a creature of particular cruelty. The term Martinet refers to a strict disciplinarian or a type of multi-tailed whip used for punishment, both meanings entirely appropriate for the vampire who preceded Cazador as the master vampire of Baldur's Gate. Velioth ruled the city's vampire coven from 1204 DR until 1276 DR, a reign of 72 years. He instructed Cazador in what he called his lessons, 3 specific rules for how a vampire should exist and rule over spawn. These lessons are preserved and can be discovered in Cazador's palace, recorded for posterity, and they reveal the philosophy of domination that Cazador inherited and embraced. The 3 lessons of Velioth, as they can be learned in the game, are these. First, act not in haste. A wolf does not simply charge, it stalks, it waits, and only when the prey is weakened does it strike. Patience is power. Second, trust is death. The only one you can trust is yourself, and even that is a risk. Allow no one close, share power with no one, for that is the path to vulnerability. Third, cruelty is the only lesson that matters. Pain and fear are the tools that ensure obedience. Show mercy once, and it will be seen as weakness. From that moment, you are doomed. These lessons speak of keeping spawn weak and desperate, of using cruelty to maintain control, of ensuring that spawn fear their master above all else. They advocate for a system of absolute terror, where mercy is weakness and kindness is foolishness. Velioth did not merely teach Cazador how to be a vampire. He taught him how to be a tyrant, a torturer, a master of psychological and physical abuse. And Velioth enforced these lessons through extreme cruelty to Cazador himself. One particularly horrific punishment is documented. When Cazador attempted to rebel or showed too much independence, Velioth impaled him and left him that way for 11 years. 11 years on a stake, unable to die, experiencing constant agony, completely helpless and displayed as a warning. This single punishment alone suggests that Velioth's abuse of Cazador may have exceeded even what Cazador later inflicted upon Astarion, though both are horrors beyond easy comparison. The fact that Astarion emerged from 2 centuries of torment with some semblance of sanity, while Cazador appears to have been completely consumed by his trauma and twisted by it, suggests the depths of what Velioth did to him. Cazador eventually destroyed Velioth in the year of the Crumbling Keep, 1276 DR, through something called the Rite of Perfect Slaughter. The details of this ritual are not fully explained in the game, but the result was clear. Cazador killed his master and broke the bonds that held him, ascending from spawn to full vampire lord, gaining true autonomy for the first time in what may have been centuries. He inherited Velioth's position as the master vampire of Baldur's Gate and claimed the Szarr Palace in the heart of the city. Interestingly, in the game you can find Velioth's skull in the dungeons beneath the palace, and through magic it will speak, sharing memories and repeating the lessons he taught, suggesting that even in death, Velioth's influence persists in Cazador's mind and methods. This timeline is important to note. Cazador turned Astarion in 1268 DR, but did not become a vampire lord until 1276 DR, 8 years later. This means that for Astarion's first eight years as a spawn, Cazador was himself still bound to Velioth, still technically a spawn, though clearly one with the authority to create spawn of his own and the knowledge of how to dominate them. This could suggest that Cazador was preparing his own collection of spawn, even while serving Velioth, perhaps in anticipation of eventually breaking free, or it might indicate that Velioth allowed or even encouraged his spawn to create lesser spawn as part of some larger design. Whatever the specific circumstances, by the time Cazador destroyed Velioth and became a vampire lord, he already had several spawn bound to him, including Astarion. The Szarr Palace is more than just Cazador's home. It is a physical manifestation of his nature, a place of beauty concealing horror. From the outside and in its public areas, it is an elegant mansion, befitting the nobility that the Szarr name suggests. The architecture is grand, the furnishings luxurious, the appearance that of a wealthy and refined household. But beneath the surface, hidden from casual view, are the true chambers of Cazador's power, dungeons where spawn are punished, cells where victims are kept, crypts where dark rituals are performed, and most horrifically, the kennels, those punishment cells where spawn who have displeased Cazador are sealed away in darkness and hunger. The palace also contains evidence of Cazador's long planning. In various locations throughout the building, players can find texts, notes, and artifacts that reveal the depths of his schemes and the extent of his cruelty. There are records of victims, documentation of the spawn he has created, texts about ancient rituals and infernal pacts. The palace is essentially a monument to Cazador's evil, every room holding some piece of the horror he has orchestrated over 2 centuries. Cazador's appearance matches the aristocratic image he cultivates. He is described as tall, especially for an elf, with long, straight black hair and pale skin characteristic of vampires. His eyes, like all vampires, are bright red. He dresses in richly detailed clothing, in shades of red and black, intricately embroidered with gold thread, with a gold chain hanging from his shoulders as a decorative accent. He is elegant, well-spoken, refined in manner. He is not a monster in appearance, not obviously evil to those who do not know him well. This is part of what makes him so dangerous. He moves through Baldur's Gate's high society when necessary, maintaining the fiction of the noble Szarr house, attending functions, maintaining connections, all while feeding on the city's population and orchestrating horrors in his palace. But make no mistake, beneath the elegant exterior, Cazador is a monster in every sense that matters. His cruelty is not the hot rage of a violent brute, but the cold calculation of someone who has studied suffering and learned how to maximize it. He does not lash out randomly, but applies pain with precision, with purpose, with an artist's attention to detail. Every punishment is designed to hurt as much as possible, to break the spirit as well as the body, to remind his spawn that they are utterly at his mercy, and that mercy is something he does not possess. Cazador's spawn are his primary victims, and he created 7 of them specifically to bear infernal contracts on their backs, though he turned others as well over the centuries. These 7 include Petras, Deliria, Violet, Leon, Eusin, Aurelia, and Astarion himself. Each was turned in circumstances similar to Astarion's, found at vulnerable moments, offered the false choice of undeath over true death, and bound into Cazador's service. Together, they formed a group bound not by friendship or solidarity, but by shared suffering and the compulsion to serve their master. The relationships between Cazador's spawn are complex and tragic. They are not allies, though one might expect people in such similar circumstances to band together. Instead, Cazador has deliberately fostered competition and division among them. They compete for his approval, knowing that those who please him may suffer less, at least temporarily. They cannot trust each other because any of them might be used as an instrument of another's punishment. They have spent decades or centuries together, but intimacy is impossible when any confidence might be reported to Cazador. Any sign of friendship might be used as leverage for torture. Cazador has perfected the art of keeping his spawn isolated even when they are together, ensuring that no solidarity can form that might threaten his control. Cazador's cruelty toward his spawn takes many forms. There is physical torture, certainly, beatings, burnings, starvation, and other forms of pain inflicted on bodies that can heal from almost any wound. meaning the torture can be extended indefinitely. Vampire spawn regenerate, so wounds heal given time and blood, which means that torture can be repeated. The same injuries inflicted again and again, without the mercy of permanent damage or death. Cazador understood this well and took full advantage, finding pleasure in watching his spawn suffer. But the physical torture was often less damaging than the psychological torment. Cazador would force spawn to hurt each other, turning them into instruments of each other's suffering. He would dangle hope of favor or better treatment, only to snatch it away. He would make promises he never intended to keep, creating expectations just to crush them. He understood that breaking someone's spirit is often more effective than breaking their body, and he applied this understanding with terrible skill. He would humiliate them, degrade them, make them feel worthless and powerless, systematically destroying any sense of dignity or self-worth they might try to maintain. One of Cazador's favorite forms of torment was his feeding ritual. He would command a spawn to bring him victims, which they were compelled to do. Then he would ask the spawn if they wanted to dine with him. If the spawn said yes, Cazador would serve them a dead, putrid rat, forcing them to consume spoiled vermin while he potentially fed on the fresh, humanoid victim. If the spawn said no, Cazador would have them flayed as punishment for refusing his hospitality. Either choice led to suffering, and this is the nature of the trap Cazador created. There were no good options, no paths that did not lead to pain, only the illusion of choice that made the suffering more acute. The kennels, those punishment cells where spawn were sealed in darkness, represented perhaps the worst of Cazador's tortures. To be entombed in blackness, unable to feed, unable to see or hear or interact with anything, for weeks or months, or in Astarion's case, an entire year, is a torture designed to destroy the mind. The isolation alone would be maddening, but combined with the constant gnawing hunger that grows but never kills, and the knowledge that you are utterly forgotten, sealed away, it becomes almost unbearable. That Astarion survived a year in the kennels and remained sane, or something close to sane, speaks to a resilience and strength that perhaps he himself does not fully recognize, though it also left psychological scars that would persist for the rest of his existence. Cazador's cruelty is not random or purposeless, though it might seem so to his victims. Every act of torment serves to reinforce his control, to remind his spawn of their powerlessness, to break down any resistance or hope they might harbor. He is methodical in his evil, following the lessons Veliath taught him, ensuring that his spawn remain useful tools rather than potential threats. And throughout it all, he maintains his facade to the outside world, the respectable nobleman of the Szarr house, hiding his true nature behind wealth and aristocratic privilege. The spawn are not Cazador's only victims, of course. As a vampire, he must feed on blood, and he does so regularly on the people of Baldur's Gate. But more insidiously, he uses his spawn to procure victims for him, forcing them to go out into the city and lure people back to the palace. This is one of the primary tasks he assigns to his spawn, and for Astarion in particular, it becomes a defining aspect of his torment. Cazador is specific about what he wants: the lonely, the desperate, the vulnerable, those whose disappearance might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. The spawn are forced to identify these people, gain their trust, and lead them back to the palace where Cazador awaits. These victims, once brought to Cazador, meet various fates, none of them good. Some are simply fed upon and killed. Others are kept alive for extended feeding, their blood drained repeatedly over time. And crucially, as would be revealed much later, many of these victims were turned into vampire spawn themselves, not to serve Cazador directly, but to be prepared for use in a ritual that would require thousands of spawn. The meals Astarion brought Cazador over 2 centuries were not all immediately consumed, but were being prepared and accumulated for a purpose Astarion would not understand until much later. For Astarion specifically, this task of luring victims was a particular torment. He was required to use his appearance, his charm, his ability to appear seductive and trustworthy, to bring people back to the palace. He had to watch them die or be turned, knowing he was responsible, knowing he had led them to this fate, unable to warn them or refuse or choose not to participate. The compulsion would drive him to complete his task regardless of how he felt about it. And over 200 years, the number of victims he was forced to lure must be staggering, each one a weight on his conscience, each one a crime he was forced to commit. Cazador also had a particular way of targeting vulnerable people, the desperate, the lonely, those who were looking for connection or hope or escape. This made his crimes even more cruel because he weaponized human need for connection, turned the desire for love or friendship into a trap. And he forced his spawn to do the same, to exploit others' vulnerabilities, to become predators in the most cynical sense, feeding on emotional needs before Cazador fed on their blood. This corruption of intimacy, the transformation of connection and trust into tools of predation, would leave lasting damage on Astarion's ability to form genuine relationships. The power dynamics between Cazador and his spawn cannot be overstated. He held absolute control, could command them to do literally anything, and they could not refuse. This is not authority in any normal sense, not the power a king has over subjects or a master over servants. This is total domination, the complete subjugation of will, closer to possession than to any mortal relationship of power. And Cazador wielded this power with malicious joy, finding pleasure in the suffering he caused, delighting in his spawn's powerlessness. Yet for all his power, for all his cruelty, Cazador is ultimately a creature driven by fear and insecurity. This becomes evident when his grand plan is revealed, but even before that, there are hints of the weakness underlying his dominance. He fears losing power, fears being vulnerable, fears being reduced again to the state of powerlessness he experienced under Veliath. His cruelty is partially an expression of this fear, an attempt to control everything around him so completely that he can never be threatened. It does not excuse his actions, but it adds dimension to his character, showing that monsters are often made, not born, shaped by their own traumas into shapes that traumatize others. Cazador's relationship with Baldur's Gate's authorities is also worth noting. As a powerful vampire lord operating in the city, one might expect the authorities to take action against him. But Cazador is wealthy, connected, and careful. The Szarr name carries weight among the patriarch. He does not feed openly or carelessly. His victims are primarily those who will not be missed, those without connections or power. And if questions are asked, there are ways to deflect them, bribes to be paid, threats to be made. All the tools of someone who understands how power works in a corrupt city like Baldur's Gate. He has operated with impunity for over 200 years as Vampire Lord, which speaks to his skill at maintaining his facade and avoiding serious investigation. In his palace, players can find a letter Cazador wrote to another Vampire Lord named Mirel Alcam, who apparently leads a vampire coven in Athkatla, another major city. In this letter, Cazador expresses a kind of competitive jealousy, suggesting that while he has been content to be the vampire lord of a major city, he has greater ambitions and plans to surpass Alcam. This reveals that Cazador is not the only vampire lord in the region, that there is apparently a hierarchy or at least a collection of vampiric powers, and that Cazador feels somewhat inferior despite his considerable power. His plan for ascension is driven partly by this desire to exceed other vampires, to become something greater than any of them. This is the master to whom Astarion was bound for 200 years. Not a simple monster, but a complex villain, someone who combines elegance with cruelty, refinement with torture, who speaks of art and culture while inflicting unimaginable suffering. Cazador represents a particular kind of evil, intelligent, methodical, self-aware evil that chooses cruelty not out of necessity, but out of preference, that could show mercy but deliberately does not, that understands exactly what it is doing and does it anyway because the suffering of others serves its purposes or simply brings it satisfaction. He is the product of abuse, who became an abuser, following the cycle that Velioth began, perfecting the methods and adding his own refinements of cruelty. Understanding Cazador is essential to understanding what Astarion survived, what shaped him, what he fears, and what drives many of his choices throughout the game. Every defense mechanism Astarion has developed, every moment of cruelty or manipulation he displays, every desperate grab for power or control can be traced back to 200 years under Cazador's dominion. The scars Cazador left on Astarion are not just physical, though those exist too, carved into his back in infernal script as part of a ritual Astarion did not understand. The deepest scars are psychological, spiritual, wounds to the very core of who Astarion is, inflicted deliberately and repeatedly by a master who understood exactly what he was doing. This is the monster from whose clutches Astarion would eventually escape, the darkness against which any light in Astarion's story must be measured. Cazador Szarr, vampire lord, torturer, the architect of 2 centuries of suffering, the master whose shadow falls across every moment of Astarion's existence, even after freedom comes. To say Astarion hates Cazador would be an understatement so profound as to be meaningless. The relationship between them is defined by absolute power, absolute cruelty, and the absolute destruction of one person's agency by another, sustained for longer than many mortal civilizations endure. A masterclass in how evil operates when it has unlimited time and power to express itself. 200 years. To put this time span in perspective, 200 years ago from our present time would place us in the early 19th century, a world utterly different from the modern era, before most of the technology and social changes that define contemporary life. 200 years is a span that encompasses multiple human generations, the rise and fall of nations, the birth and death of everyone you might have known. For Astarion, 200 years was the length of his servitude to Cazador, 200 years of unlife, 200 years of torture and compulsion and stolen autonomy. To truly understand Astarion's character, we must explore what those 2 centuries entailed, the daily reality of existence as Cazador's spawn, and the psychological and emotional toll of such prolonged suffering. Time moves differently for elves than for humans, and differently still for the undead. High elves can live for 7 centuries or more under natural circumstances, so in one sense, 200 years represents a significant but not overwhelming portion of a potential elven lifespan. But for the undead, time loses some of its normal meaning. There is no aging, no progression through life stages, no natural endpoint. Each night is essentially identical to the previous in terms of physical existence, creating a repetition that can be maddening, a loop of darkness and servitude without variation, except in the specific torments Cazador might devise. This monotony of existence, stretching across 2 centuries, creates its own form of psychological torture. Astarion's daily existence under Cazador followed certain patterns, routines established by his master and enforced through supernatural compulsion. During the day, vampires and their spawn must rest, sheltered from the sun that would destroy them. For Cazador's spawn, this rest took place in the dungeons beneath the palace, in coffins or simple sleeping chambers, away from any possibility of sunlight. This was perhaps the only time Astarion had anything approaching peace, though even the dormancy of undead rest is different from mortal sleep, and it might be troubled by dark dreams or memories. When night fell, Astarion would rise, and his duties would begin. The primary task Cazador assigned to his spawn was the procurement of victims. This was not a gentle or abstract assignment. It meant going out into Baldur's Gate, into the streets and taverns and public spaces, and finding people to lure back to the palace. Cazador was specific about what he wanted: the lonely, the desperate, the vulnerable, those whose disappearance might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. This required Astarion to become an actor, a manipulator, someone who could identify vulnerability and exploit it with practiced efficiency. Astarion had certain advantages for this task. He is, by all accounts, beautiful, with the striking features characteristic of high elves, enhanced by the pale, ethereal quality vampirism lent him. He learned to weaponize this appearance, to present himself as charming, interested, seductive. He would approach targets in public spaces, strike up conversations, create the illusion of connection or attraction, offer whatever the person seemed to be seeking: companionship, romance, adventure, escape from their troubles. And then, when trust was established, he would suggest moving somewhere more private and lead them back toward the palace, toward Cazador, toward their doom. The compulsion to complete this task was absolute. Astarion could not simply refuse to hunt for victims. If he tried, the magical bond would force him to comply. He could not warn his targets, could not tell them what awaited them, could not do anything that would meaningfully interfere with delivering them to Cazador. The commands Cazador had laid upon him prevented any action that would undermine his master's interests. Astarion was a trap that walked and talked and smiled, aware of what he was doing, hating it, but unable to stop himself. Over 200 years, the number of people Astarion was forced to lure to their deaths or transformation must be staggering. Thousands, certainly, perhaps tens of thousands, depending on how frequently Cazador demanded new victims, each one a person with their own life, their own hopes and fears, their own loved ones who would mourn them or wonder what happened. Each one a weight on Astarion's conscience, even though he had no choice in the matter, even though he was as much a victim as they were. The guilt of this forced complicity is one of the deepest wounds Cazador inflicted, turning Astarion into an instrument of evil against his will, making him participate in atrocities he could not prevent. The psychological impact of being forced to repeatedly lure people to their deaths cannot be overstated. It creates a specific kind of trauma, a sense of complicity even when agency is absent, a stain on the soul that feels permanent, even though the actions were compelled. Astarion had to watch victim after victim arrive at the palace trusting him, only to discover the truth too late. He had to see their faces as they realized they had been betrayed, as Cazador fed on them, or turned them, or killed them. He had to live with the knowledge that his face was the last friendly face these people saw, that he had used their vulnerabilities against them, that in some way he bore responsibility even if he had no choice. This forced participation in evil also shaped how Astarion viewed himself. It is difficult to maintain a sense of moral worth when you are repeatedly made to commit immoral acts. even knowing the acts are compelled, even understanding intellectually that he was a victim. The emotional reality of being an instrument of murder corrodes self-perception. Astarion began to see himself as a monster, not just because of what he was physically, but because of what he was made to do. The boundary between himself and his actions blurred, and the guilt became part of his identity, inseparable from his sense of self. This internalized guilt and self-loathing would persist even after freedom, making it difficult for Astarion to accept that he deserves kindness or happiness. Between hunting assignments, there was the daily degradation of life in the palace. Cazador was not content merely to use his spawn as tools. He seemed to take active pleasure in reminding them of their powerlessness. He would summon them for no reason other than to exert his control, order them to perform humiliating acts, verbally abuse them, pit them against each other in competitions or forced conflicts. The spawn lived in constant tension, never knowing when Cazador might decide to punish one of them, never sure if something they said or did might trigger his cruelty. This state of hypervigilance, maintained across 2 centuries, would leave permanent marks on Astarion's psyche, making him always wary, always expecting danger, even after escaping Cazador's direct control. The punishments Cazador devised were creative in their cruelty. Physical torture was common. Beatings, burnings, starvation, and other forms of pain inflicted on bodies that can heal from almost any wound. Vampire spawn regenerate given time and blood, which means torture can be extended indefinitely. Wounds inflicted knowing they will heal, so the process can be repeated. Cazador understood this well and took full advantage. He would torture his spawn for infractions real or imagined, sometimes for nothing at all except his own amusement. The unpredictability of punishment was itself a form of torture, as the spawn could never feel safe, never know what might set Cazador off. But the physical torture was often less damaging than the psychological torment. Cazador would force spawn to hurt each other, turning them into instruments of each other's suffering. He would use their relationships as weapons, threatening one spawn through another, creating situations where a spawn's suffering might be lessened by increasing another's pain. He would dangle hope of favor or better treatment, only to snatch it away at the last moment. He would make promises he never intended to keep, creating expectations just to crush them. He understood that breaking someone's spirit is often more effective than breaking their body, and he applied this understanding with terrible skill. The kennels, those punishment cells where spawn were sealed in darkness, represented perhaps the worst of Cazador's tortures. To be entombed in blackness, unable to feed, unable to see or hear or interact with anything, for weeks or months, or in Astarion's case, an entire year, is a torture designed to destroy the mind. The isolation alone would be maddening for any social creature, but combined with the constant gnawing hunger that grows but never kills, never offers the release of unconsciousness, and the knowledge that you are utterly forgotten, sealed away, perhaps forever, it becomes almost unbearable. That Astarion survived a year in the kennels during his first decade as a spawn and remained sane, or something close to sane, speaks to a resilience and strength that perhaps he himself does not fully recognize. But it also left psychological scars that would never fully heal, a deep fear of confinement and abandonment that would persist throughout his undead existence. The hunger, always the hunger, was another constant torment. Vampire spawn need blood to survive, to maintain their strength, to function. But Cazador controlled when they could feed and what they could feed on. Often, he would restrict their feeding, keeping them weak and desperate, the hunger a constant distraction and source of suffering. His first rule, that spawn shall not drink the blood of thinking creatures, meant that Astarion and the others were forbidden from feeding on humanoids without explicit permission. When Cazador did allow feeding, it was often on rats or other vermin rather than humanoid blood, a humiliation and inadequate sustenance that left the spawn always slightly starved, always slightly weakened, always reminded of their degraded state. There were times when Cazador was away from the palace, engaged in his own business in the city or elsewhere. These periods offered the spawn a slight respite from direct oversight, though they remained bound by his standing commands and unable to truly act against his interests. But even this small freedom was double-edged, because in Cazador's absence, the spawn still had to fulfill their duties, still had to hunt and lure victims, still had to exist knowing that failure or disobedience would be punished when the master returned. There was never truly a time when they were free of his shadow, never a moment when they could fully relax or feel safe. The relationship between the spawn themselves, as mentioned before, was corrupted by Cazador's manipulation. They could not be allies in any meaningful sense because the compulsion to obey Cazador superseded any loyalty they might feel to each other. They could be forced to spy on each other, to report each other's words to Cazador, to participate in each other's punishment. If Cazador commanded one spawn to torture another, that spawn would have no choice but to comply, regardless of any friendship or fellow feeling that might exist. Trust was impossible under these circumstances. Friendship was dangerous, as any connection might be used as leverage for torture. The closest they could come to connection was a shared understanding of suffering, but even that was tainted by the knowledge that any of them might be used against the others at any moment. Astarion developed defense mechanisms to survive this existence, psychological adaptations that allowed him to endure without completely breaking. Some of these mechanisms are evident in his personality as players encounter him in the game. The sharp wit used as a shield, deflecting genuine emotion with sarcasm and jokes. The apparent cruelty and selfishness that protect against caring too much about others, since caring leads to vulnerability. The obsessive focus on gaining power to prevent future victimization, believing that strength is the only protection against being hurt. The difficulty trusting or accepting genuine kindness, expecting betrayal or manipulation, because that is all he has known. These are not flaws in Astarion so much as survival strategies, ways he learned to navigate 2 centuries of horror without losing himself entirely. One particularly insidious aspect of Cazador's control was how it prevented even the fantasy of rebellion. Astarion could not plot against his master in any serious way, because any such plot would be prevented by the compulsion. He could not seek help from others, because he could not act on that help if it involved disobeying Cazador. He could not even fully articulate to himself what freedom might mean, or how it might be achieved, because the very thought of acting against Cazador would trigger the magical bonds. His mind remained his own in terms of thoughts and feelings, but it was constrained within invisible walls that made certain thoughts and actions simply impossible to translate into reality. The passage of time itself became a form of torture. Years blended together in a monotonous succession of nights, each essentially like the last, with no progress, no growth, no change except in the accumulation of trauma. Decades passed, then a century, then 2 centuries approached, and nothing fundamentally changed in Astarion's circumstances. The world outside evolved, politics shifted. People he once knew as a magistrate grew old and died while he remained frozen in undeath. But his daily existence remained constant. Serve Cazador, hunt victims, endure abuse, survive another night, repeat endlessly. This temporal trap, the knowledge that nothing would ever change unless something external intervened, created a special kind of despair. There were perhaps small moments of beauty or peace, that Astarion managed to find even in these circumstances. A rare sunset viewed from a window before taking shelter from the coming day, remembering how it had felt to walk in daylight without fear. A moment of genuine laughter with another spawn when Cazador was absent, brief and dangerous but real. A successful hunt that pleased Cazador enough to earn a night without active torture, just the background misery of servitude. These moments would have been precious beyond measure, tiny lights in an overwhelming darkness, clung to desperately because they were all there was. But these moments could never erase or even balance the horror. 200 years of being forced to murder, 200 years of physical and psychological torture, 200 years without autonomy or hope or end in sight, 200 years of being a thing rather than a person, owned rather than free, property rather than individual. The cumulative weight of this suffering is difficult for anyone who has not experienced something similar to truly comprehend. Each night added to the total, each year another layer of trauma, until the damage ran so deep that it became fundamental to who Astarion was, woven into the fabric of his identity in ways that could never be fully untangled. By the time of the events of Baldur's Gate 3, set in 1492 DR, Astarion had been Cazador's spawn for approximately 224 years since his turning in 1268 DR, though the game generally rounds this to over 200 years, or nearly 200 years, for simplicity. This means that Astarion spent more time as a vampire spawn than many humans live entire lives. His existence as undead servant far exceeded his mortal existence of 39 years. The experiences of those 2 centuries had shaped him more profoundly than anything from his mortal life, had become the dominant narrative of his existence, had defined him in ways he might never fully escape, even if he achieved freedom. The survival of any sense of self through such prolonged torment is remarkable. That Astarion retained his personality, his intelligence, his capacity for wit and charm, even if used as weapons, his ability to hope, even if that hope seemed futile, speaks to a core of resilience that even Cazador's worst efforts could not fully extinguish. But survival came at tremendous cost, leaving psychological scars, trauma responses, patterns of behavior designed for an environment of constant threat, difficulty with vulnerability or trust, and a desperate need for control, stemming from 2 centuries of having none whatsoever. This is what Astarion endured, night after night, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. This is the weight he carries, the history that explains his every action, the context without which his character cannot be fully understood. 200 years of torment, of being forced to be a monster, of suffering under the absolute power of a master who delighted in cruelty, of losing autonomy so completely that even his own body was not his to control. 200 years that should have destroyed him completely, but somehow did not, though they came close, so very close, and left him damaged in ways that might never fully heal, scars that would persist even into freedom, defining how he sees himself and the world around him. This ritual, known as the rite of profane ascension, is central to understanding not just Cazador's motivations, but the full horror of what Astarion and his fellow spawn truly were. Not just slaves, but sacrifices. Not just servants, but fuel for their master's apotheosis. The rite of profane ascension is an ancient ritual, its origins lost in the dark history of vampirism, passed down through generations of undead masters, refined and improved upon over centuries, each iteration more terrible than the last. The ritual's purpose is to transcend the normal limitations of vampirism, to become what is known as a vampire ascendant, a being that retains all the powers of vampirism while losing most or all of the traditional weaknesses. A vampire ascendant can walk in sunlight without burning. They can cross running water without difficulty. They possess magic and physical might far beyond normal vampires. They are freed from the constant thirst for blood that drives lesser vampires. They become, in essence, nearly divine in their power, undead gods walking the mortal plane. But such power demands a terrible price, and that price is measured in souls. The rite of profane ascension requires the sacrifice of 7,000 souls, not just any souls, but specifically the souls of vampire spawn, bound to the ritualist through the blood bond, murdered in a ceremony that channels their essence, their undead life force, into the ascension of their master. 7,000 souls consumed, 7,000 undead existences snuffed out, their power stolen and absorbed, their very beings destroyed to fuel another's transformation. Cazador learned of this ritual through his master Velioth, who had learned it from his master before him, a chain of vampiric knowledge passed down through ages. Based on the evidence found in Cazador's palace, it appears that each vampire lord who has ruled Baldur's Gate's vampire coven has known of this ritual and aspired to it, though none succeeded in completing it before Cazador made his attempt. Velioth had been pursuing the ritual himself, gathering spawn for this purpose, but Cazador destroyed him before Velioth could complete it. Some of Velioth's notes and research remained, however, and Cazador inherited not just his master's domain, but his ambitions. Where Velioth had failed, Cazador was determined to succeed. The knowledge of how to perform the ritual came from an infernal source. At some point after becoming Vampire Lord in 1276 DR, Cazador made a pact with the archdevil Mephistopheles, one of the most powerful beings in the Nine Hells. This pact granted Cazador the specific knowledge needed to perform the rite of profane ascension, the exact words and procedures, the magical configurations required, and perhaps most importantly, the solution to a practical problem that would have otherwise been insurmountable. The scale of the requirement, 7,000 spawn, presented Cazador with a significant challenge. Creating that many spawn would take time, enormous time, and would require a steady stream of victims to turn. Moreover, turning someone into a spawn is not a trivial act. Each spawn created adds to the vampire's family, a connection that must be maintained through the blood bond, and 7,000 spawn would be impossible to control directly. The magical and mental burden of maintaining that many blood bonds simultaneously would likely destroy even a powerful vampire lord. The ritual required a specific structure, a hierarchy of spawn, and Cazador needed to find a way to create this structure without being overwhelmed by the logistics. The solution Cazador devised, granted to him through his pact with Mephistopheles, was as clever as it was cruel. He would not create 7,000 spawn himself. Instead, he would create a small number of spawn, 7 specific individuals who would serve as nodes in the ritual, and he would carve into their flesh, into their very skin, infernal contracts written in the language of the hells. These contracts, inscribed on the backs of his 7 chosen spawn, would allow them to create spawn of their own, something vampire spawn normally cannot do under any circumstances. The spawn created by Cazador's 7 would be bound through them to Cazador himself, creating a pyramid of servitude with Cazador at the apex. Each of Cazador's 7 spawn was to create 1,000 spawn themselves, though they would not know this was the purpose of the scars on their backs, would not understand the infernal script carved into their flesh, would not realize they were being prepared as components of a ritual. Once each had created their 1,000, and Cazador himself had his 7, The total would be 7,007 souls bound to Cazador through blood and infernal magic, the exact number required for the ritual. Astarion was one of these 7, one of the chosen, though he did not know it for most of his undead existence. The scars on his back, which he could not see himself without mirrors, and which none of the other spawn could read, were a contract written in infernal, a language of devils and dark magic. These scars were carved into him by Cazador personally, a ritual that was undoubtedly excruciating. Cazador himself mentions that he took the longest with Astarion, that he enjoyed hearing Astarion scream as the infernal script was inscribed. The scars remained on his undead flesh, a mystery he could not solve, a part of himself he could not understand, a violation that marked him literally and figuratively as Cazador's property and tool. The psychological impact of bearing these scars cannot be understated. Astarion knew they were there, could feel them, but could not see them clearly or understand their meaning. When asked about them, he would say they were something Cazador did to him, calling them poems, as Cazador had mockingly referred to them, but their true purpose remained hidden. They were a constant reminder of Cazador's ownership, a permanent mark on his body that he had no say in receiving. For someone who had already lost all autonomy, to have his very skin used as parchment for his master's purposes added another layer of violation. His body was not his own, not even its surface, not even something as personal as his skin. The ritual itself requires specific conditions and components beyond just the 7,000 souls. There must be a ritual chamber, a place prepared with specific magical configurations. There must be sacrifices of the 7 key spawn, the ones bearing the infernal contracts, their deaths triggering the cascade that consumes all 7,000 souls bound to them and to Cazador. There must be the precise recitation of the ritual's words in infernal, the channeling of the power at exactly the right moment, the willingness to commit an act of murder on such a scale that it would shock even those familiar with vampiric cruelty. Cazador prepared for this ritual with meticulous care over the 2 centuries since he destroyed Velioth in 1276 Doctar. He established the ritual chamber deep beneath his palace, in caverns and dungeons that honeycombed the foundations of the building. He acquired the necessary magical components, consulted ancient texts, maintained his pact with Mephistopheles to ensure the contract scars would function as needed. He carefully selected his 7 spawn, choosing individuals who would serve his purposes. What specific qualities he looked for is not entirely clear, whether it was their appearance, their skills, their personalities, or simply their availability at the right moments. We know he chose them, and that choice sealed their fates as sacrifices. The other 6 spawn-bearing contract scars, like Astarion, were his brothers and sisters in suffering. Petras, Deliria, Violet, Leon, Eusin, and Aurelia each bore the same markings on their backs. Each was designated as a node in the ritual. Each was marked for death when the time came. They did not know this, could not know, because the scars were written in infernal, and none of them could read that language. They lived for decades or centuries with these marks, symbols of their doom, without understanding what they meant. This ignorance was perhaps a mercy, sparing them the knowledge that they were always meant to die. But it also meant they could not prepare, could not resist, could not even fully understand their own situation. For Astarion, the discovery of the ritual's true nature comes as a shock and a revelation during the events of Baldur's Gate 3. For 200 years, he endured suffering without understanding its full purpose. He knew Cazador was evil, knew the vampire lord enjoyed tormenting his spawn, but the scope of the plan, the fact that he was always meant to die as part of Cazador's ascension, that his entire existence as a spawn was merely preparation for his sacrifice adds a dimension of horror to everything he experienced. It was not just cruelty for cruelty's sake, though that was certainly present. It was cruelty with purpose. Every moment of suffering part of a larger design that would culminate in his destruction. The realization that he was always expendable, always meant to be consumed, that Cazador never saw him as anything more than a component of a ritual, a resource to be used up, fundamentally recontextualizes Astarion's entire undead existence. It means that every moment of false kindness from Cazador, every rare respite from torture, every time Astarion thought he might have earned some small measure of regard, was a lie. Cazador was simply maintaining his investment, keeping his ritual components functional until they were needed. There was never any possibility of earning genuine favor or consideration, because to Cazador, Astarion was already dead, just waiting for the ritual to make it official. The infernal contracts carved into the backs of the seven spawn are themselves artifacts of dark magic, deserving examination. Infernal, the language of devils and the nine hells, is not merely a means of communication, but a language of binding and contract, where words have literal power and agreements written in infernal carry weight beyond mortal law. The contracts on the spawn's backs are written in this language, carefully crafted to create the specific magical conditions necessary for the ritual, while also granting the spawn the ability to create spawn of their own, something that should be impossible for vampire spawn under normal circumstances. This ability would remain dormant, activated only when needed for the ritual's completion. The process by which these contracts were carved into the spawn must have been a ritual in itself, painful beyond measure, using tools or magic designed to mark undead flesh permanently, to inscribe the words deeply enough that they would remain throughout the spawn's existence. Cazador would have taken his time with this, ensuring each letter was perfect, each clause properly structured, because any flaw in the infernal script could undermine the entire ritual. For the spawn receiving these marks, it would have been torture extended over hours or days, their backs flayed open, the burning pain of infernal magic searing into their flesh, all while being unable to resist or even fully understand what was being done to them. Astarion's scars specifically have become iconic in the game, visible when he is seen without a shirt, a complex pattern of lines and symbols covering his back from shoulders to waist. Players initially might mistake them for decorative tattoos or simple scars from torture, but as the story unfolds, their true nature as an infernal contract becomes clear. The revelation of what these scars mean, what they were intended to accomplish, is one of the most horrifying moments in Astarion's personal questline, the moment when he realizes just how thoroughly Cazador had planned his destruction. The ritual chamber where the rite of profane ascension was to take place is located deep beneath the Szarr Palace, in caverns that seem to extend far below the normal foundations of the building. This chamber is not merely a room, but a specially constructed space, carved with runes and symbols of power, designed to channel and contain the massive magical energies that would be released during the ritual. The chamber includes specific positions for the seven spawn, who bear the infernal contracts, places where they would be held during the ritual through magical bindings, arrangements for containing and then releasing the souls of the 7,000 spawn who would die to fuel Cazador's ascension. In the center of this chamber is a focal point, a place where Cazador himself would stand to perform the ritual, to speak the words of power in infernal, to become the conduit through which 7,000 souls would flow, transforming him in the process. The ritual, once begun, would be irreversible, a cascade of death and dark magic that would consume everything in its path until either Cazador achieved ascension or the ritual collapsed, potentially destroying everyone involved. The implications of the ritual extend beyond just Cazador and his spawn. 7,000 deaths, even deaths of undead beings, represent an act of such profound evil that it would likely have consequences beyond the immediate transformation. The ritual draws on infernal power, creates a connection to the 9 hells through the pact with Mephistopheles, channels energies associated with damnation and corruption. A successful vampire ascendant would be a threat not just to individuals, but to entire regions. A being of such power that few could stand against them, freed from the traditional constraints that limit even vampire lords. Cazador's letter to Mirel Alcam suggests that after his ascension, he planned to begin subjugating other vampire lords, expanding his dominion beyond Baldur's Gate to create an empire of darkness. Cazador's motivation for pursuing this ritual stems partly from his own experience as a spawn under Velioth. He knows what it is to be powerless, and he is absolutely determined never to be powerless again. The ascension represents not just power for its own sake, but security, the ultimate insurance against ever being victimized again. It is an understandable motivation, twisted into monstrous action. The trauma of his own enslavement transformed into the justification for creating and then destroying 7,000 spawn of his own. But there is also an element of pure ambition in Cazador's pursuit of the ritual. He is not content to be merely a vampire lord, one of many powerful undead in the world. He wants to be unique, to transcend his category, to become something that has no equals or rivals. The timeline of Cazador's preparation is important to understand. He has been working toward this ritual for approximately 200 years, since shortly after he destroyed Velioth in 1276 Doctar. This means that every action he took during this period, every spawn he created, every torment he inflicted, was in service of this ultimate goal. The 200 years of Astarion's suffering were not random or purposeless, but part of a plan that had been in motion from almost the moment Astarion was turned. Cazador was patient, methodical, willing to wait as long as necessary to ensure everything was perfect for the ritual. The fact that Cazador had not yet completed the ritual by the time of Baldur's Gate 3's events in 1492 DR suggests that gathering 7,000 spawn, even through the pyramid structure of his 7 key spawn, creating spawn of their own, proved more difficult than anticipated. The 7 spawn-bearing infernal contracts had not yet been compelled to create their 1,000 spawn each, suggesting that Cazador was still in the preparation phase, perhaps waiting for the perfect moment or the right conditions. His perfectionism and patience, learned from Velioth's lessons, made him unwilling to proceed until every detail was absolutely correct, knowing that he would likely only have one chance to perform the ritual successfully. Whatever the delays, by the time of the game's events, Cazador is close to ready. The ritual chamber is prepared. The 7 spawn-bearing infernal contracts are still in his possession, or so he believes, until Astarion's unexpected absence disrupts his plans. The magical components have been gathered. The knowledge necessary to perform the ritual has been acquired and studied for 2 centuries. The pact with Mephistopheles remains in force. All that remains is to gather his spawn, position them correctly, activate the contracts on their backs to create the necessary 7,000 spawn, speak the words, and ascend to godlike power, leaving 7,000 destroyed souls in his wake. For Astarion, learning about the ritual while free from Cazador's direct control creates a terrible dilemma and a dark temptation. On one hand, he now knows that returning to Cazador means death, that he was always meant to die as a sacrifice, that there is no negotiating or reasoning with his former master. The ritual requires his death, and Cazador will stop at nothing to reclaim him. On the other hand, the ritual itself represents power of a magnitude that could protect Astarion from ever being vulnerable again. If somehow he could take Cazador's place in the ritual, if he could become the one who ascends rather than one of the sacrifices, he would gain everything he has desperately wanted: power, freedom from vampiric weaknesses, the ability to walk in sunlight again without needing the tadpole, and most importantly, the strength to ensure no one could ever hurt him again. This temptation is central to Astarion's character arc in the game. The rite of profane ascension dangles before him a solution to all his problems, an end to his vulnerability, the ultimate revenge against Cazador, and the acquisition of power that would make him effectively invincible. All it would cost is 7,000 souls, including his fellow spawn, the people who suffered alongside him under Cazador, who would die to fuel his transformation, just as they would have died to fuel Cazador's. The moral weight of this choice is staggering, and the game does not make the decision easy or obvious. The ritual also raises questions about the nature of vampire spawn souls. In Dungeons & Dragons lore, the state of undead beings' souls is complex and varies depending on the specific type of undead. Vampire spawn retain their personalities and memories, suggesting their souls are still present in some sense, though corrupted and bound by the vampiric curse. The ritual's requirement of 7,000 souls suggests that spawn do indeed possess souls that can be consumed, harvested, destroyed for magical purposes. This means that every spawn Cazador created was not just enslaved in unlife, but would be truly destroyed by the ritual, their souls consumed, their existence ended in a way that might preclude any afterlife or peace. It is annihilation on a scale that defies easy comprehension. For the 7 spawn who bear the infernal contracts, there is an additional layer of horror. They are not just victims of the ritual, but components of it, their very bodies inscribed with the magic that makes the ritual possible. Destroying them does not just kill them, but activates the contracts carved into their flesh, triggering the cascade that consumes all the souls bound through them to Cazador. Their deaths are the keys that unlock the ritual's power, making them simultaneously victims and instruments of the greatest mass murder in Cazador's long career of murder. This dual nature, being both victim and instrument, adds a particular cruelty to their situation. The rite of profane ascension thus represents the ultimate expression of Cazador's evil, the culmination of 2 centuries of planning and cruelty, the transformation of suffering into power on a scale that beggars imagination. It is the reason behind everything Astarion endured, the purpose that justified in Cazador's mind every torture, every humiliation, every moment of anguish inflicted on his spawn. And it is the choice that will define what kind of person Astarion becomes, whether he rejects the power purchased with so many souls, or whether he embraces it, becoming in the process a new monster to replace the old one, perhaps more terrible for understanding exactly what he is doing and choosing to do it anyway. This choice, when it comes, will determine not just Astarion's fate, but his very soul, the decision between remaining himself or becoming what he hates. After 200 years of absolute bondage, freedom came to Astarion in the most unexpected way imaginable. Through an alien horror, a tadpole inserted into his brain by mind flayers, creatures whose very existence is nightmare made flesh. The events that led to Astarion's liberation from Cazador's control are bizarre and violent. involving the invasion of Faerun by mind flayers, the catastrophic crash of a nautiloid ship, and the inadvertent severing of the blood bond that had defined Astarion's existence for 2 centuries. This liberation was not planned, not earned through any action of Astarion's own, but arrived as a side effect of a different horror entirely, a cruel irony that freedom should come wrapped in such terrible circumstances. Mind flayers, also known as illithids, are among the most terrifying creatures in the Dungeons & Dragons universe. They are aberrations, beings from beyond the normal planes of existence, characterized by their octopus-like heads, their psionic powers, and their method of reproduction, which involves implanting tadpoles into the brains of humanoid hosts. These tadpoles gradually consume the host's brain and transform them into new mind flayers through a process called seromorphosis that is universally regarded as one of the most horrific fates that can befall a thinking being. The host's personality, memories, everything that made them who they were, is consumed and destroyed, replaced by the alien consciousness of the illithid. This transformation typically takes about 7 days from infection to completion. The particular group of mind flayers responsible for Astarion's abduction were operating a nautiloid, a strange organic ship that mind flayers use to travel, capable of moving between planes of existence and through normal space. This nautiloid was on a mission connected to the Absolute, a plot that forms the main storyline of Baldur's Gate 3. But part of that mission involved gathering hosts for seromorphosis, collecting a variety of individuals from Baldur's Gate and surrounding areas to serve as raw material for creating new mind flayers. The ship moved through the city, abducting people seemingly at random, though with some selection process that remains somewhat mysterious. On the night that changed everything, Astarion was likely engaged in his usual grim work, hunting for victims to lure back to Cazador, moving through Baldur's Gate streets with the practiced ease of someone who had done this thousands of times over 2 centuries. Perhaps he was in the process of approaching a target, or returning from a successful hunt, or simply navigating the city on some other task Cazador had assigned. Whatever he was doing, it was interrupted by the mind flayer's arrival. The nautiloid descended over the city, and its crew began their abduction operation. The abduction itself must have been sudden and violent. Mind flayers are efficient in their capture methods, using their psionic powers to overwhelm victims, to stun and subdue them before they can react or flee. For Astarion, who possessed the enhanced speed and senses of a vampire spawn, the fact that he could not escape suggests the mind flayers were both quick and powerful, or perhaps that they specifically targeted him with multiple illithids. One moment he was in Baldur's Gate, the next he was being pulled upward, away from the city, toward the nautiloid hovering above. The experience must have been terrifying and disorienting, a violation different from but perhaps as profound as what Cazador had done to him. Being captured by mind flayers would normally be a death sentence, or worse than death, a guarantee of transformation into something alien and monstrous. But for Astarion, this horror came with an unexpected gift, though he could not know it immediately. The nautiloid's influence, the presence of so many mind flayers and their psionic powers, the magical energies surrounding the ship, all of this interfered with the blood bond that connected Astarion to Cazador. The bond did not break immediately or completely, but it weakened, stretched to its limit by the dimensional and magical forces at work. The psionic emanations from the mind flayers and their ship created interference in the vampiric magic that had bound Astarion for 2 centuries. Aboard the nautiloid, Astarion would have found himself in a nightmare environment, a ship that was simultaneously vessel and creature, its walls organic and pulsing, its atmosphere alien, surrounded by mind flayers and other captured victims. The interior of a nautiloid is designed for mind flayers, not for humanoid comfort, and the very architecture would feel wrong, disturbing, other. The ship itself is a living thing in some sense, grown rather than built, and being inside it is like being swallowed by some vast organism. The process of tadpole insertion is shown in the game's opening sequence. Victims are restrained, unable to move or resist, and a mind flayer approaches with a tadpole, a larval, illithid creature that writhes and squirms with a life of its own. This tadpole is inserted directly into the victim's eye, burrowing through the eyeball and the socket beyond, forcing its way through tissue to reach the brain, where it will begin the transformation process. The moment of insertion is described as excruciating, a pain unlike anything most victims have ever experienced. The tadpole forcing its way through flesh and bone, settling into the brain tissue, establishing its presence as a foreign entity that will eventually consume and replace the host entirely. For Astarion, this represented a new horror layered atop 2 centuries of existing horror, a new threat to his existence, a new form of violation. He had survived Cazador's torments, had endured 200 years of abuse, but seramorphosis is not something that can be survived or endured. It is a transformation that destroys the self completely, leaving nothing of the original person behind. The Astarion who had learned to survive as Cazador's spawn would cease to exist, replaced by an illithid that might retain some of his memories, but would not be him in any meaningful sense. This prospect must have been terrifying, in a way different from the constant terror of Cazador's slavery, because it meant not just continued suffering, but complete obliteration of self. But something went wrong with the seramorphosis process, or perhaps right, depending on perspective. The tadpoles inserted into Astarion and the other captives aboard the nautiloid were not normal illithid tadpoles. They had been altered, modified in ways that would become clear later in the game's story, transformed by the Absolute's influence and power. These modified tadpoles were imbued with different properties than typical mind flayer larvae. They did not immediately begin the transformation process as normal tadpoles would. Instead, they granted their hosts certain powers, psionic abilities that could be accessed and controlled, while the full seramorphosis was delayed or prevented entirely by the tadpole's altered nature. Moreover, and most critically for Astarion, the tadpole in his brain further weakened and ultimately severed the blood bond to Cazador. The alien presence, the psionic energies it emanated, the modifications the tadpole had undergone that connected it to the Absolute, all combined to interfere with the vampiric magic that had bound Astarion for 200 years. The tadpole essentially created psychic noise that disrupted the supernatural connection between spawn and master. For the first time since that night in the alley when Cazador found him dying in 1268 DR, Astarion's will was his own. He could not hear Cazador's commands because the connection was severed. He could not feel the compulsion because the magical pathway was broken. He was finally and truly free of that supernatural control that had defined his existence for over 2 centuries. The realization of this freedom did not come immediately. Astarion was still trapped aboard the nautiloid, still facing the threat of seramorphosis, still surrounded by mind flayers and danger, still trying to process the trauma of abduction and tadpole insertion. But at some point, perhaps in a moment of expected compulsion that did not come, perhaps in a gradual dawning awareness, perhaps simply in the absence of Cazador's constant presence in the back of his mind, Astarion realized that Cazador's voice was gone, that the bond was broken, that he was free in a way he had not been for 2 centuries. This realization must have been overwhelming, a mixture of joy, terror, disbelief, and confusion, all crashing over him at once. But the celebration of freedom had to be brief and internal, because the nautiloid itself was in crisis. The ship came under attack shortly after the abductions began. The exact nature of this attack varies slightly depending on player choices and perspective, but it appears that forces defending Faerun, possibly including Githyanki, dragon riders who are natural enemies of mind flayers, engaged the nautiloid in combat. The ship was damaged, its integrity compromised, and it began to malfunction catastrophically. In its damaged state, the nautiloid began jumping between planes of existence erratically, unable to control its dimensional travel. It tumbled through the 9 hells briefly, where players can see devils and hellscape through the ship's membranes. It phased through other dimensions, reality becoming unstable around it. Finally, critically damaged and unable to maintain dimensional stability, it crashed. The nautiloid smashed into the ground in the region near Baldur's Gate, along the river Kionthar, somewhere east of the city and west of Elturel, with tremendous force. The crash should have killed everyone aboard. The violence of the impact, the destruction of the nautiloid's organic structure, the explosive release of magical energies, all of these factors should have been unsurvivable. The ship literally tore apart, sections breaking off, the living vessel dying as it struck the earth. But somehow, miraculously or cursedly depending on one's perspective, Astarion survived, as did several other victims who had been aboard the nautiloid. Whether this survival was due to the tadpole's influence protecting their hosts, sheer luck, some property of the nautiloid's structure that created pockets of safety during the crash, or divine intervention from gods with an interest in the tadpole victims, the end result was the same. Astarion found himself alive, or at least undead and functional, having somehow survived an unsurvivable catastrophe. He awakened on a beach near where the nautiloid had crashed, with only fragmented memories of the crash itself and the realization that everything had changed. The wreckage of the nautiloid was nearby, still burning or steaming, pieces of the organic ship scattered across the landscape. Other survivors were beginning to stir, confused and traumatized, each dealing with their own realization of what had happened to them. And Astarion, for the first time in 200 years, was free. He was free from Cazador. The blood bond was severed. He could not feel his master's presence, could not hear commands, was not compelled to obey. He had a tadpole in his brain that should kill him through cerimorphosis, but apparently was not doing so immediately. He was outside the city where he had suffered for so long, outside Cazador's immediate reach, outside the palace that had been his prison. And most remarkably, most impossibly, the sun was rising, and normally this would mean Astarion would need to seek shelter immediately, would burn if exposed to direct sunlight, but the tadpole had granted him another, unexpected gift: immunity to the sun. The same modification that prevented immediate cerimorphosis also blocked the vampiric vulnerability to sunlight, allowing Astarion to walk in daylight for the first time in 200 years. This gift is difficult to overstate in its significance. Sunlight had been a barrier, a cage, a reminder of what he had lost when Cazador turned him. The night had been his entire world for 2 centuries. Now, standing on that beach, feeling sunlight on his skin without pain, without burning, without needing to flee to darkness, Astarion experienced something he thought he would never feel again. It must have been overwhelming, emotional in a way that perhaps even he did not fully expect. A restoration of something fundamental that he had mourned as permanently lost. Standing on that beach, feeling sunlight on his skin without pain, knowing he could think and act without Cazador's compulsion overriding his will. Astarion experienced freedom for the first time in 2 centuries. It was fragile freedom, threatened by the tadpole and the possibility of Cazador hunting him down. But it was real. He was not compelled. He was not bound. He could make choices, his choices, about what to do next, where to go, who to be. After 200 years of being told what to do every moment of his existence, the sudden absence of that control must have been as terrifying as it was exhilarating. The irony of the situation was not lost on Astarion, and he comments on it if players speak with him about his circumstances. He had been saved by being abducted by mind flayers, creatures whose normal behavior would have resulted in his destruction and transformation into something utterly alien. The tadpole in his brain, which represented a death sentence under normal circumstances, had instead given him freedom and the ability to walk in sunlight. The crash that should have killed him had instead delivered him to a place far from his tormentor. Every aspect of his liberation came through horror and catastrophe. Freedom granted not as a gift, but as a side effect of other terrible events. It is the universe's cruelest joke, and Astarion appreciates the dark humor of it, even as he struggles with the reality. This liberation through catastrophe becomes a defining aspect of Astarion's story in Baldur's Gate 3. He is free, but he does not know for how long. The tadpole might suddenly begin its transformation, despite its modifications. Cazador might still be able to sense him somehow, or will certainly hunt for him once he realizes his spawn has escaped. His freedom is conditional, temporary, potentially illusory, and maintaining it will require actions and choices that will test everything he has become during his 2 centuries of bondage. Meeting the other survivors of the Nautiloid crash, individuals who share his predicament of tadpole infection, offers Astarion potential allies in navigating this new situation. But 200 years of slavery have not prepared him for genuine cooperation or trust. His instinct, honed by centuries of survival in Cazador's service, is to manipulate, to ensure his own survival at any cost, to view others as potential threats or tools rather than companions. The social skills he developed under Cazador, skills designed for luring victims and surviving in an environment of constant threat, are not well suited to building actual relationships or working cooperatively toward shared goals. When players first encounter Astarion in the game, he attempts to ambush them, holding a knife to the player character's throat. This is not inherently villainous, but rather a defensive response born of 200 years of trauma. He sees a potential threat and acts to neutralize it before it can harm him. Only when he realizes the player character also has a tadpole, also shares his predicament, does he reconsider and suggest cooperation. But even this cooperation is presented in terms of mutual benefit rather than genuine alliance. His opening interactions reveal someone who is deeply damaged, profoundly distrustful, and struggling to navigate freedom with skills developed for survival in captivity. Yet the situation demands cooperation. The tadpoles, for all their unexpected benefits, like immunity to sunlight, remain a threat. Finding a way to remove them without triggering seromorphosis becomes an urgent priority for all the survivors. And Cazador, while no longer able to directly compel Astarion, remains a threat, a powerful vampire lord who will certainly want to reclaim his escaped spawn, especially one of the 7 bearing infernal contracts necessary for the rite of profane ascension. Astarion's freedom is real but precarious, a state that could be revoked at any moment by the transformation of the tadpole or by recapture by his former master. The Nautiloid crash and its aftermath thus represent not an ending but a beginning, not the conclusion of Astarion's story, but the start of a new chapter, one where he must learn to be a person again, rather than a slave, where he must navigate freedom after 2 centuries of bondage, where he must decide who he wants to be now that he has the agency to make such decisions. The catastrophe that freed him also left him adrift, without the horrible certainty of his existence under Cazador, but also without clear direction or understanding of how to proceed. He has freedom, but no framework for using it healthily, power over his own choices, but 2 centuries of conditioning, telling him that survival requires cruelty, manipulation, and the accumulation of power at any cost. This is the state in which players first encounter Astarion in Baldur's Gate 3, freshly freed, deeply traumatized, wielding freedom like an unfamiliar weapon, desperate to maintain his liberation while terrified it will be stripped away, his personality a mix of genuine traits and defense mechanisms, his path forward uncertain, his past weighing heavily on every choice he makes. The nautiloid was both curse and blessing, horror and salvation, the catastrophe that ended one nightmare even as it began another, different kind of trial, the trial of deciding what to do with freedom after spending 2 centuries without it, the trial of becoming someone worthy of that freedom rather than being consumed by the darkness that shaped him. With freedom comes choice, and with choice comes responsibility, consequence, and the opportunity for both redemption and damnation. Astarion's journey after escaping Cazador's control is not simply a matter of survival, though survival remains important, but a process of self-discovery, moral reckoning, and the fundamental question of what kind of person he will choose to be now that being a person is again within his power. The companions he meets, the relationships he forms, the decisions he makes, all contribute to a narrative that can lead toward healing and growth, or toward becoming the very thing he suffered under for 2 centuries. The first encounters Astarion has with other survivors of the nautiloid crash set the tone for his early journey. His approach is manipulative and self-serving, immediately attempting to establish dominance, or at least secure his position. When he first meets the player character, he literally holds a knife to their throat, ready to kill them if they prove to be a threat, displaying both the paranoia of someone who has spent 2 centuries in danger and the willingness to use violence preemptively that he learned as Cazador's spawn. Only when he realizes the player character also has a tadpole, also shares his predicament, does he reconsider and suggest cooperation. But even this cooperation is presented in terms of mutual benefit rather than genuine alliance. His approach is transactional, calculating, viewing relationships through the lens of what they can provide, rather than as connections with inherent value. Astarion's initial personality as players encounter him is characterized by several key traits, all of them traceable to his trauma and survival strategies. He is sarcastic and cutting, using wit as both weapon and shield, deflecting genuine emotion or vulnerability with jokes or cruel observations. When serious topics arise, he often responds with flippancy or mockery, maintaining distance from feelings that might make him vulnerable. He is openly selfish, prioritizing his own needs and desires, viewing cooperation as a means to his own ends rather than an end in itself. He makes no apology for this selfishness, treating it as simple pragmatism, the obvious way to navigate a dangerous world. He approves of cruelty and power, responding positively when the player character chooses violent or domineering options, and seems to lack empathy for others' suffering. When the party encounters people in need, Astarion's typical response is to suggest ignoring them or even exploiting their vulnerability. When violence is an option, he often advocates for it, seeing it as the most efficient solution. When the player displays mercy or kindness, he may mock them for weakness, suggesting that such behavior will only invite exploitation. His worldview is fundamentally cynical, shaped by 2 centuries where kindness was punished and cruelty was the only lesson that mattered, to quote Veliath's teaching that Cazador embraced. He is deeply distrustful, assuming everyone has hidden motives, that kindness is manipulation, that vulnerability will be punished. He expects betrayal because betrayal is what he knows. He expects pain because pain is what he received. He expects that people are fundamentally self-interested because in his experience, the alternative led only to suffering. This distrust makes genuine connection difficult, as he cannot easily believe that others might care for him without ulterior motive, or that showing vulnerability will not result in that vulnerability being weaponized against him. But these traits, while genuine aspects of who Astarion has become, are not the entirety of who he is. They are armor, protection, strategies developed over 2 centuries to survive in an environment where empathy was weakness and trust was fatal. Beneath them, occasionally visible in unguarded moments, is a person who still remembers what it was like to be mortal, who retains capacity for connection and growth, who is not beyond reaching even if reaching him requires patience and genuine care. When the player shows him consistent kindness without expecting anything in return, when they defend him or support him without making demands, small cracks appear in his armor. Brief glimpses of the person beneath the defenses emerge, suggesting that the damage Cazador inflicted, while profound, was not total. The companions Astarion travels with represent a diverse group, each with their own traumas, secrets, and moral frameworks. There is Shadowheart, a cleric of Szarr, goddess of darkness and loss, carrying her own secrets and wrestling with questions of faith and identity. There is Gale, a wizard who consumed a piece of powerful magic that now threatens to destroy him and everything around him, dealing with his own mistakes and their consequences. There is Lyazel, a Githyanki warrior, rigid and militant, following her people's harsh culture while beginning to question it. There is Will, the Blade of Frontiers, a warlock bound to a devil despite his heroic intentions, struggling with the price of the power he sought. There is Karlach, a tiefling barbarian whose heart was literally replaced with an infernal engine, burning from within, dealing with rage and the knowledge of her limited time. Each of them damaged in their own way, each struggling with their own demons, literal or metaphorical. Among these companions, Astarion finds, not quite acceptance, not at first, but a provisional place, a group that tolerates his presence, because they share the tadpole predicament and because numbers offer safety in their dangerous situation. But as they journey together, facing threats and challenges, making camp each night, gradually learning each other's stories through conversation and shared experience, something begins to shift. The companions are not perfect, not uniformly good or kind, but they offer something Astarion has not had in 200 years, the possibility of genuine connection. Relationships not based on power dynamics or compulsion, but on slowly growing trust and shared experience. The journey itself takes them through various regions, facing threats that require cooperation. They battle mind flayers and their servants. They navigate the complexities of various factions with competing interests. They uncover a conspiracy involving the Absolute that threatens the entire region. Through these experiences, the party begins to function as a unit, learning to work together, developing strategies that play to each member's strengths. For Astarion, this experience of genuine teamwork, where he is valued for his skills and contributions rather than exploited for Cazador's benefit, is novel and initially uncomfortable. Astarion's romance option in the game is particularly significant for his character development. If the player character pursues a relationship with him, it begins, predictably, as manipulation on Astarion's part. He approaches it as a seduction, a calculated strategy to secure the player's protection and support, using the skills he developed, luring victims for Cazador. He is beautiful, charming, overtly sexual, and he wields these traits deliberately, viewing the potential relationship in transactional terms, provide pleasure and companionship in exchange for being valued and protected by someone powerful. His initial romantic overtures are performed rather than genuine, following scripts he learned over 2 centuries of being forced to seduce people to their doom. But something unexpected happens if the relationship continues beyond that initial seduction. Astarion begins to develop genuine feelings, real attachment, actual care for the player character that goes beyond transaction or manipulation. This terrifies him because genuine emotion means genuine vulnerability, and vulnerability is dangerous. He has spent 2 centuries being hurt, being powerless, being used, and opening himself to actually caring about someone means opening himself to being hurt again in new ways. The prospect of genuine intimacy, after 200 years where every intimate act was tainted by compulsion or purpose, is both appealing and frightening. The romance storyline allows players to see past Astarion's defenses, to understand that his manipulative behavior comes from trauma rather than inherent evil, and to help him navigate toward healthier ways of relating to others. A particularly powerful moment in Astarion's romance involves him confessing that he does not know what he wants from the relationship, that all his previous sexual experiences were tools of manipulation or forced upon him by Cazador's commands, that he has never had genuine intimacy that was not tainted by compulsion or purpose. He admits that he is not sure what sex or intimacy mean to him when they are actually his choice, when they are not part of a hunt or a command. The player can choose to continue the physical relationship, which Astarion may appreciate, but which does not necessarily address his deeper needs. Or, significantly, the player can choose to be with Astarion without sex, affirming that he is valued for himself rather than for what he can provide physically. This choice, the option to have a relationship built on emotional connection rather than physical performance, represents a profound shift for someone whose body has been used as a tool and weapon for so long. It demonstrates that the player sees him as a person rather than as a source of pleasure, that his worth is not contingent on his ability to perform seduction, that he can be valued simply for who he is. This moment is transformative for Astarion if the player chooses this path. It begins the process of reclaiming his body and his intimacy as his own, of learning that relationships can exist without exploitation, that vulnerability does not always lead to pain. It does not instantly heal 2 centuries of trauma, but it plants a seed, creates a foundation on which genuine healing can begin to build. The romance, handled with care and patience by the player, becomes one avenue through which Astarion can learn to trust again, to connect again, to be vulnerable again in ways that are healthy rather than dangerous. The journey toward Baldur's Gate, which takes up much of the game's narrative, is also a journey toward Astarion's past, toward the place of his torment, toward eventual confrontation with Cazador. As the party's adventures lead them closer to the city, Astarion's anxiety increases. He knows Cazador is there, knows the vampire lord will want to reclaim him, knows that returning to Baldur's Gate means risking everything he has gained. The city represents both his origins and his trauma, the place where he was mortal, and the place where he suffered for 2 centuries. Approaching it creates a mounting sense of dread and anticipation. but he also knows that true freedom cannot be achieved by running forever. Cazador represents unfinished business, a threat that will persist as long as the vampire lord lives. The ritual means that Cazador will never stop hunting for Astarion, will never accept the loss of one of his 7 key spawn, will pursue him relentlessly until either Astarion is recaptured or Cazador is destroyed. The tadpole situation also drives the party toward Baldur's Gate, as the city represents the best chance of finding a cure or solution to their shared predicament. All roads lead to the city, and with it, to confrontation with the past. Throughout the journey, players can influence Astarion's moral development through their choices and how they respond to him, consistently choosing kind options, showing mercy, helping others without expecting reward. All of these choices subtly challenge Astarion's worldview that power and cruelty are all that matter. When the player demonstrates that kindness can be strength rather than weakness, that helping others can create genuine alliances, that mercy can lead to better outcomes than cruelty, it provides evidence contrary to everything Cazador taught him. Conversely, choosing cruel options, embracing violence and domination, reinforce his worst instincts and push him toward becoming more like Cazador, confirming his belief that the world is a place where only the strong survive and compassion is a luxury that leads to exploitation. The game does not force a particular path, but allows Astarion's character to develop organically based on the influences around him and the choices he makes. He can become more cruel or more compassionate, more power-hungry or more willing to value things beyond power, more isolated or more connected, depending on how the journey unfolds and what lessons he learns from it. Key moments in this development include encounters with people who remind Astarion of his victims. When the party meets individuals who are vulnerable, who trust too easily, who are looking for connection, Astarion may see reflections of the thousands of people he was forced to lure to their deaths. These encounters can trigger memories, force him to confront the weight of his forced complicity in Cazador's murders. The player can help him process this guilt, acknowledging that he was forced and had no choice, while also validating that the pain he feels about it is real and understandable. Or the player can dismiss it as irrelevant, suggest that dwelling on the past is pointless, encourage him to focus only on survival and power. The former approach opens paths toward healing and accepting responsibility without being crushed by guilt. The latter reinforces his tendency to suppress empathy and focus only on self-preservation. Another significant element is Astarion's relationship with the tadpole's powers. The tadpole grants psionic abilities, and there are opportunities throughout the game to embrace these powers more fully, to consume additional tadpoles to become stronger, to potentially undergo a partial transformation that grants even greater abilities. For Astarion, who is desperate for power as protection against future victimization, the temptation to embrace these powers is strong. Power has always meant safety in his understanding, and the tadpoles offer power. But doing so means accepting the very thing that should be his death sentence, means becoming less himself and more something alien, means choosing power at the cost of identity. This creates a tension. The power that might protect him also threatens to destroy who he is, to transform him into something that is no longer Astarion. The player can encourage him to resist this temptation, to value his identity over power, or can support his embracing of the tadpole's gifts, prioritizing strength over self. This choice has implications for how Astarion views the trade-off between power and identity, a theme that will become central when he faces the choice regarding the rite of profane ascension. The theme of power versus self is central to Astarion's arc. He believes, based on 200 years of experience, that power is the only thing that matters, that being powerful means being safe, that if he can just become strong enough, no one will ever hurt him again. This belief drives many of his choices and preferences, his approval of ruthless actions, his dismissal of mercy as weakness, his focus on acquiring strength and advantages. But the journey with the companions, particularly if genuine relationships develop, offers an alternative model. That connection, trust, and community can provide safety and strength in ways that individual power cannot. That being vulnerable with others who care for you is not the same as being powerless under someone who wants to hurt you. This is a difficult lesson for Astarion to learn. 2 centuries of experience tell him that vulnerability leads to pain, that trust is dangerous, that relying on others will only end in betrayal or abandonment. But if the player and other companions consistently demonstrate otherwise, if they prove reliable and supportive without exploiting his moments of vulnerability, slowly, incrementally, Astarion may begin to consider that perhaps there is another way, that perhaps the alternative to being Cazador is not simply being his victim, that perhaps genuine strength can exist alongside vulnerability when it is shared with people who genuinely care. Astarion's personal quest involves discovering more about his past, uncovering information about the ritual, learning to read the infernal scars on his back, and ultimately planning how to deal with Cazador. This investigation takes the party through various locations in and around Baldur's Gate as they draw closer to the city. They speak with people who have encountered Cazador or know of the Szarr family. They find texts about vampire lords and their practices. They piece together the full scope of what Cazador has planned and what Astarion's role in it was always meant to be. The moment when Astarion finally learns what the scars on his back mean, when someone who can read infernal translates the contract carved into his flesh, is one of the most significant in his entire questline. The revelation can come through Raphael, a devil who offers to explain the scars in exchange for dealing with a problem he has. When Astarion learns that the scars are an infernal contract, that they are part of the rite of profane ascension, that he was always meant to die as a sacrifice, that his entire existence as a spawn was merely preparation for his destruction in a ritual that would consume 7,000 souls. The impact is profound. The discovery that he was always expendable, always meant to be consumed, that Cazador never saw him as anything more than a component of a ritual, a resource to be used up, fundamentally recontextualizes Astarion's entire undead existence. It means that every moment of false kindness from Cazador, every rare respite from torture, every time Astarion thought he might have earned some small measure of regard, was a lie. Cazador was simply maintaining his investment, keeping his ritual components functional until they were needed. There was never any possibility of earning genuine favor or consideration, because to Cazador, Astarion was already dead, just waiting for the ritual to make it official. The rage, grief, and betrayal he feels at this revelation are immense, and how the player helps him process these emotions significantly impacts his character development. The player can validate his anger, affirm that what was done to him was monstrous, support his need for revenge, while also encouraging him to think carefully about what that revenge should look like. Or the player can focus primarily on the power the ritual represents, suggesting that Astarion should consider taking Cazador's place in the ritual, using the 7,000 souls to ascend himself. This latter approach feeds into Astarion's worst instincts, his belief that power is all that matters, his willingness to do anything to never be vulnerable again. But alongside the horror of learning he was meant to be sacrificed comes the temptation of the ritual itself. If Cazador can ascend by sacrificing 7,000 spawn, including Astarion, then it stands to reason that Astarion could potentially ascend by sacrificing those same 7,000 spawn, substituting himself for Cazador in the ritual. This possibility dangles before him constantly once he learns of it. The solution to all his problems wrapped in the deaths of thousands, including his fellow spawn, who have suffered alongside him under Cazador. Power sufficient to walk in sunlight without the tadpole. Freedom from all vampiric weaknesses. Strength to ensure no one could ever hurt him again. All of it within reach, if he is willing to pay the price in souls. The moral weight of this temptation is explored throughout the remainder of Astarion's questline. Is revenge against Cazador worth 7,000 lives? Is Astarion's safety and power worth the destruction of souls? Would ascension solve his problems, or simply transform him into a new version of the monster he hates? Different companions offer different perspectives on this question. Some may suggest that the spawn are monsters anyway, that their deaths would rid the world of vampiric threats. Others may argue that the spawn are victims like Astarion, that they deserve the chance at freedom he received. The player's stance on it significantly influences which path Astarion ultimately chooses when the moment of decision comes. As the party grows stronger and the time approaches for confronting Cazador, Astarion must grapple with who he wants to be. The person who survives by any means necessary, who prioritizes his own power and safety above all else, who would sacrifice thousands to never be vulnerable again? Or someone who recognizes that becoming Cazador, even to destroy Cazador, means losing himself in a different way, that some prices are too high to pay even for safety, that choosing to do better than his abuser is possible, even if it is harder. This journey of potential redemption or damnation is not simple or straightforward. Astarion has been damaged in profound ways, and healing from 2 centuries of trauma is not accomplished quickly or easily. He backslides, struggles, makes choices based on fear rather than wisdom. He has moments of cruelty or selfishness even as he is developing capacity for kindness. He questions whether he deserves to be saved or whether he is too far gone, too corrupted by what he was forced to do and become. But he also shows capacity for growth, moments of genuine connection, glimpses of the person he might become if given the chance and support to change. The journey is ongoing, uncertain, and ultimately dependent on choices both Astarion and those around him make. It is a realistic portrayal of how people navigate trauma and the long, difficult process of becoming something other than what suffering has made them. The path to redemption is available, but it is not easy or guaranteed. The path to damnation is equally available, seductive in its promise of power and safety. Which path Astarion takes will be determined in the streets and dungeons of Baldur's Gate, in the confrontation with his past, in the moment when he must choose between power and principle, between safety purchased with atrocity and vulnerability embraced with integrity. The return to Baldur's Gate represents more than just a physical journey for Astarion. It is a return to the site of his trauma, the city where he was murdered and reborn as a vampire spawn, where he spent 200 years in captivity, where every street corner might hold memories of victims he was forced to lure, where the Szarr Palace still stands as a monument to his suffering. Walking these streets again as a free person, or as close to free as he can be, with a tadpole in his brain and Cazador still alive and hunting for him, stirs complex emotions: fear of recapture, anger at what was done to him, grief for the life he lost, and a burning desire for revenge that has been building for 2 centuries. The city itself has changed little in the time since Astarion was last able to observe it freely. Baldur's Gate endures, a sprawling metropolis of commerce and corruption, its grand buildings and squalid slums existing side by side, the wealthy patriarch living in luxury, while the poor struggle to survive in the shadows. For someone who spent 2 centuries unable to truly see or appreciate the city, except through the narrow lens of hunting for victims under compulsion, returning with actual freedom of movement and perspective must be profoundly disorienting. These are streets he walked countless times, but always under compulsion, always with Cazador's commands driving his actions, always focused on the hunt. Now he can choose where to go, when to stop, who to speak with, and this simple autonomy is both exhilarating and terrifying. One of the first significant encounters upon returning to Baldur's Gate involves meeting other spawn, not Cazador's primary 7, but spawn, who were created as part of the larger structure for the ritual. The game reveals that many of the victims Astarion and the others lured over the centuries were not simply killed, but were turned into spawn themselves, prepared for eventual use in the rite of profane ascension. These spawn are still under Cazador's control, still compelled to obey, and encountering them forces Astarion to see reflections of what he was, bound, desperate, unable to disobey, trapped in servitude. The contrast between their continued slavery and his freedom is stark and painful, highlighting both how far he has come and how easily he could be dragged back to that state if Cazador recaptures him. These encounters with other spawn also reveal that Cazador is actively searching for Astarion. The vampire lord knows his spawn has escaped, understands that one of the 7 key components of his ritual is missing, and is determined to reclaim his property. The spawn Astarion meets may have been sent specifically to find him, under orders to report any sign of the missing spawn. The threat is real and immediate. Cazador will not let Astarion go, not when he represents a crucial element of the rite of profane ascension, not when allowing a spawn to escape successfully would undermine Cazador's absolute control over his other servants and potentially inspire them to seek freedom themselves. The Szarr Palace itself looms over this section of Astarion's story, a physical presence in the city, a place he can see from certain vantage points, a destination he knows he must eventually approach, but dreads with every fiber of his being. The palace that was his prison for 200 years, where he was tortured and humiliated and broken, where the kennels still wait in darkness, where Cazador still resides preparing for his ritual, where Astarion's fellow spawn remain trapped. The thought of entering that place again, even with companions, even with the intent to finally confront his tormentor, fills Astarion with visceral fear that he may try to mask with bravado, but cannot entirely suppress. This fear is not weakness or cowardice. It is the entirely reasonable response of someone who has been profoundly traumatized by a place and the person who rules it. Astarion has spent 200 years learning that the palace means pain, that Cazador is absolute power, that defiance is futile and punished with exquisite cruelty. These lessons are carved into his psyche as deeply as the infernal scars are carved into his back. Unlearning them, finding the courage to face Cazador despite everything his mind and body are screaming at him about the danger, requires immense strength and the support of people who believe in him and will stand with him against the monster who made him. The party can help Astarion prepare for the confrontation by gathering information about Cazador's current activities and the layout of the palace. They can acquire weapons and magical items that might help in the fight against a powerful vampire lord. And most importantly, they can simply be present, offering the solidarity of numbers and friendship against the isolation Astarion endured for so long. The player character's role is particularly significant here. If Astarion has developed genuine relationships with the player, whether romantic or platonic, their support and belief in him can provide the emotional foundation he needs to face his greatest fear. Knowing that he is not alone, that he has people who care about him and will fight for him, makes the impossible seem possible. Before the final confrontation, there are opportunities to learn more details about Cazador's plans, to discover where in the palace the ritual chamber is located, to understand the specifics of how the rite of profane ascension will be performed if Cazador succeeds. This knowledge is both empowering and horrifying. Empowering because understanding Cazador's plan provides opportunities to disrupt it, to turn the vampire lord's own machinations against him, to identify weaknesses in the ritual's structure. Horrifying because the full scope of the evil Cazador planned becomes impossible to ignore. 7,000 souls, 7,000 people who were turned into spawn, specifically to die for Cazador's ascension, their entire existences reduced to fuel for his transformation into something approaching a god. Among these 7,000 are Astarion's fellow spawn, the 6 others who bear infernal contracts like his: Petras, Deliria, Violet, Leon, Eusen, and Aurelia. They have suffered as he has suffered, endured the same torments under Cazador's cruelty, been marked with the same scars for the same purpose. They are not friends, exactly. The dynamics of Cazador's household made genuine friendship impossible, as he deliberately fostered competition and division among them. But they are the closest thing to family Astarion has had in 200 years, bound by shared suffering, if nothing else. The ritual will kill them, consume their souls along with the 7,000 others, and Astarion must decide how much he cares about their fates, whether saving them matters to him, whether he views them as fellow victims deserving of rescue, or simply as components of a ritual he might exploit for his own purposes. The player's influence on Astarion's thinking during this period is crucial, encouraging him to view his fellow spawn as people worth saving, emphasizing the value of their lives and the horror of their destruction, reminding him that they are victims as he was a victim, can push him toward the path of stopping the ritual entirely and freeing everyone. Conversely, focusing on power, on Astarion's own safety and strength, suggesting that using the ritual for his own ascension is justified revenge against Cazador and a reasonable way to ensure he is never vulnerable again, can push him toward the darker path of replacing Cazador as the ritual's beneficiary. The approach to the palace can be handled in various ways depending on player choice and strategy. The party might attempt a direct assault, fighting through whatever guards and defenses Cazador has established. They might use stealth, infiltrating the palace quietly and avoiding unnecessary combat. They might use knowledge of the palace's layout, which Astarion retains from his time there, to find secret entrances or less defended approaches. However it is accomplished, eventually the party will make their way through the palace toward its depths, toward the ritual chamber where Cazador awaits, where the 7 spawn will be gathered, where 200 years of suffering will finally reach its climax. The journey through the palace itself must be deeply traumatic for Astarion. Every room holds memories, every corridor a reminder of countless nights of suffering. He can point out locations of significance if players ask or if he chooses to share. Here is where Cazador would summon them for his cruel entertainments. There is where spawn were punished for infractions real or imagined. Down that passage lies the entrance to the kennels where Astarion spent a year in darkness and hunger. The palace is a museum of horror, each exhibit a piece of Astarion's trauma made physical, and walking through it requires him to confront memory after memory, to face the reality of what he endured, rather than suppressing or deflecting it with his usual sarcasm and dismissiveness. The companion's reactions to seeing the palace and learning more about what Astarion experienced there are important moments for his character development. This is when many of them truly understand the depth and extent of his suffering. When the casual cruelty he sometimes displays is recontextualized by the systematic cruelty inflicted upon him. When his desperate need for power and control makes tragic sense. Some companions may express sympathy, others anger on his behalf, others grim determination to help him end this chapter of his life. Their support, their visible rage at what was done to him, their willingness to risk themselves to help him confront Cazador. All of this reinforces that Astarion is not alone anymore, that he has people who care about him and will fight for him, that he matters to them not as a tool or a victim, but as a person they value. As the party descends deeper into the palace, moving toward the dungeons beneath, the signs of Cazador's preparations for the ritual become more evident. Magical arrays etched into the floors and walls, infernal symbols glowing with dark power, the accumulation of necromantic energy that suggests something momentous is about to occur. The atmosphere grows heavier, more oppressive, as they approach the ritual chamber. Cazador knows they are coming. Perhaps he has been tracking their progress through the palace. Perhaps his spawn have reported their approach. Perhaps he simply feels Astarion's presence now that his wayward spawn has returned to his domain. The other spawn are already present in the ritual chamber when the party arrives, held in place by magical bindings, unable to escape or resist, positioned at specific points corresponding to the infernal contracts carved into their backs. They are conscious, aware of what is about to happen to them if the ritual proceeds, terrified but powerless to prevent it. Seeing them, seeing his fellow victims of Cazador's centuries-long plan, held like sacrificial lambs, drives home the reality of what the ritual means. Not abstract numbers, but specific people, individuals he has known for decades or centuries, about to be destroyed along with thousands of others to fuel one vampire's mad ambition. And at the center of it all stands Cazador Szarr himself, vampire lord, master of the Szarr Palace, architect of 2 centuries of suffering, on the verge of achieving the apotheosis he has sought for over 200 years. He is elegant as always, composed, confident, viewing Astarion's arrival not as a threat but as the return of a wayward possession, something to be collected and returned to its proper place in the ritual. His greeting to Astarion is likely patronizing, dismissive of any growth or change Astarion has undergone, treating him as the powerless spawn he was rather than the person he is becoming. Cazador's arrogance blinds him to the reality that Astarion is no longer the broken creature he remembers, that the spawn has been changed by freedom and companionship in ways Cazador cannot comprehend. The confrontation with Cazador is inevitable now. 200 years of questions, rage, pain, and desperate yearning for freedom have led to this moment. Everything Astarion has become, for better or worse, stems from what Cazador did to him, and everything Cazador has planned requires Astarion's death and the consumption of his soul. Only one of them can leave this chamber having achieved their goals, and the battle to determine which one will be fierce, desperate, and definitive. This is the moment where Astarion's past and future collide, where he must face the source of his trauma, not as a powerless victim, but as someone who has reclaimed enough of himself to fight back, where the question of who he will choose to be will be answered through action rather than merely contemplation. The ritual chamber beneath the Szarr Palace is a place of concentrated evil, a room where 2 centuries of planning and suffering converge into a single moment of crisis. The chamber is vast, carved with arcane symbols and infernal script that glows with unholy light, the walls inscribed with runes of binding and transformation. The 6 other spawn bearing infernal contracts are positioned at specific points around the chamber, held in place by magical bonds that suspend them above the ground, preventing any movement or escape. They are conscious and terrified, aware of what is about to happen to them, their faces showing the same fear and helplessness that Astarion himself felt for 2 centuries. The air itself feels heavy with dark power, the accumulated energy of Cazador's preparations making the atmosphere oppressive, thick with the weight of impending atrocity. Cazador stands at the ritual's focal point, prepared to begin the ceremony that will sacrifice 7,000 souls to transform him into a vampire ascendant. His confidence is absolute, born of 2 centuries of unchallenged power as vampire lord, of the knowledge that he has planned this moment meticulously, of his conviction that Astarion and whatever companions he has brought are no true threat to him. In Cazador's mind, this is already decided. The wayward spawn will be reclaimed, positioned correctly in the ritual, and everything will proceed as planned. The idea that Astarion might actually pose a danger to him seems not to have seriously occurred to Cazador. So complete is his sense of superiority and control. He has broken Astarion so thoroughly, or so he believes, that the possibility of genuine resistance seems implausible. This underestimation is Cazador's first critical mistake, but his arrogance runs deeper than mere tactical error. Cazador has spent so long being absolutely powerful within his domain, so long having his every command obeyed instantly and without question, that he has lost the ability to conceive of genuine resistance from his spawn. Astarion is, in Cazador's mind, a thing that belongs to him, and things do not successfully rebel against their owners. This fundamental failure of imagination, this inability to recognize that Astarion has changed and is no longer the broken spawn of old, creates an opening that Astarion and his companions can exploit. When the party enters the chamber, Cazador moves to reclaim Astarion immediately, using the power of the ritual space itself to reassert control. Through the magic of the ritual chamber and the infernal contracts, Cazador is able to pull Astarion into one of the ritual positions, binding him alongside the other 6 spawn. For a moment, it seems that all is lost, that Cazador will simply perform the ritual as planned, that 2 centuries of suffering will culminate in Astarion's destruction after all. This moment of helplessness, of being bound and unable to resist, must be one of the most terrifying of Astarion's entire existence, a return to powerlessness just when freedom seemed within reach. But Astarion is not alone this time, and this makes all the difference. His companions, the people he has traveled with, fought beside, formed connections with, despite his best efforts to maintain emotional distance, they do not abandon him. They fight to free him from the ritual bindings, engaging Cazador in combat while working to disrupt the magical bonds holding Astarion in place. The battle that ensues is not merely physical, but also magical and psychological. A desperate struggle against a powerful vampire lord who has centuries of combat experience, formidable magical abilities, and the home ground advantage of fighting in a place he has prepared extensively. Cazador is a formidable opponent. He possesses enhanced strength and speed, the ability to regenerate from wounds that would kill lesser beings, various magical abilities including charm effects and necromantic powers, and the tactical advantage of knowing the ritual chamber intimately. He can summon creatures to his aid, use the chamber's magical infrastructure to his advantage, and he retains many of the traditional vampiric powers. Fighting him should be nearly impossible for any group, let alone one that must simultaneously work to free Astarion from magical bonds while defending themselves. But Astarion's companions are extraordinary in their own rights. The party that has traveled together, fought together, survived impossible odds together, now brings all their accumulated power and skill to bear against Cazador. Spells are cast to disrupt his magic and injure his undead form. Physical attacks from multiple angles force him to divide his attention. Tactical coordination that the party has developed through their journey allows them to exploit openings in his defense. The battle is desperate and difficult, requiring everything the party has learned throughout their adventures, pushing them to their limits and beyond. For Astarion, once freed from the binding, this battle is unlike any other he has fought. This is his abuser, his tormentor, the source of 2 centuries of nightmares, and facing him in combat means confronting not just a powerful enemy, but his own fear, his own learned helplessness, the voice in his head that still insists Cazador is invincible, that resistance is futile, that he should submit and accept his fate. Fighting against Cazador means fighting against his own conditioning, pushing past the psychological chains even as he attempts to help break the physical threat Cazador represents. The player character's role in this battle extends beyond just dealing damage to Cazador. Their support of Astarion, their belief in him, their willingness to risk themselves to help him achieve freedom, all of this provides emotional and psychological reinforcement that helps Astarion maintain his resolve and fight effectively. This is not a battle he could win alone, not just because Cazador is too powerful for a single spawn to defeat, but because the psychological weight of 2 centuries of abuse would crush him without the support of others who see him as a person worth saving. As the battle progresses and Cazador begins to realize he is actually in danger, his demeanor shifts from confident superiority to fury, and then to something approaching desperation. The idea that his carefully laid plans might be disrupted, that this spawn he tortured and controlled for 200 years might actually defeat him, is incomprehensible and enraging. He may attempt to use manipulation, trying to get inside Astarion's head with reminders of his powerlessness, suggesting that Astarion will always be his, that freedom is an illusion. He may try to use the compulsion, attempting to reassert control over Astarion by commanding him to stop fighting, to submit, to return to his proper place. But the tadpole's interference with the blood bond holds. The commands that would once have been absolutely effective now fail. The magical pathway remains severed, and Astarion remains free to act according to his own will. This failure of compulsion, this demonstration that Cazador's absolute power over him is truly broken, represents a fundamental shift in the power dynamic that has defined their relationship for 2 centuries. Cazador is just a vampire lord now, powerful but not omnipotent, and Astarion is not his slave but his enemy. Eventually, through skill, determination, magic, and the power of genuine companionship, Cazador is defeated. The powerful vampire lord who has terrorized his spawn for centuries, who has operated with impunity in Baldur's Gate for over 200 years, who was on the verge of achieving godlike power, is brought low, wounded, weakened, rendered unable to continue fighting. He is not yet destroyed, vampires being notoriously difficult to kill permanently, but he is at the party's mercy, vulnerable for perhaps the first time in his long undead existence. This is the moment that defines Astarion's entire arc, the choice that will determine who he ultimately becomes. Cazador is defeated but not dead. The ritual chamber is prepared and ready. The 6 other spawn are still held in magical bonds in their ritual positions, and Astarion understands the ritual's mechanics well enough to know that he could take Cazador's place. The knowledge that Raphael provided, the understanding of how the ritual works, creates a terrible possibility. Instead of being the sacrifice, Astarion could be the beneficiary. Instead of dying to fuel Cazador's ascension, he could ascend himself. The mechanics of this substitution are revealed by Cazador himself in a final act of cruelty, or perhaps simple honesty. If Astarion attempts to use the ritual, he will be consumed by it because he bears the infernal contract scars on his back, marking him as one of the 7 sacrifices required. The ritual requires exactly 7,007 souls, and Astarion is one of those 7. However, through the connection created by the tadpole, Astarion can perform a remarkable trick. He can use his psychic link to the player character to copy the scars from his own back onto Cazador's back, essentially making Cazador into one of the 7 sacrifices in his place. This would allow Astarion to perform the ritual, consuming Cazador along with the 7,000 souls bound through the pyramid structure, and ascend to become a vampire ascendant himself. The temptation is overwhelming. Everything Astarion has wanted since gaining freedom is right here within his grasp. Power sufficient to protect himself from any future threat, immunity to the sun without needing the tadpole, freedom from all vampiric weaknesses, including the constant hunger, the ability to walk as a near god among mortals. All it requires is completing the ritual, sacrificing the 7,000 souls that Cazador gathered, and ascending. The 7,000 souls include spawn, who are themselves monsters, vampire spawn who have committed murders while serving Cazador, or the 7 spawn who created them. Destroying them could be seen as ridding the world of vampiric threats, and by ascending, Astarion would ensure he could never be victimized again, never be powerless again, never be at anyone's mercy. The arguments for ascension are seductive and not entirely unreasonable given Astarion's circumstances. He has suffered terribly and for an incomprehensibly long time. The desire to secure his own safety is completely understandable after 2 centuries of torment. The power of ascension would allow him to do good on a grand scale potentially, to protect others, to ensure justice is done. The ends could potentially justify the means, especially given the extremity of what he has endured, and the alternative, remaining a vampire spawn, still bound by vampiric limitations, still vulnerable to those who might hurt him, seems unbearably risky after everything he has survived. But the arguments against ascension are equally compelling and strike at the heart of who Astarion will choose to be. Completing the ritual means becoming like Cazador in the ways that matter most, valuing power over life, treating others as means to an end rather than as people with their own value. It means sacrificing his fellow spawn, people who have suffered as he has suffered, who are victims as he was a victim, who deserve the chance at freedom he has received. It means consuming 7,000 souls, an act of evil so profound that it would fundamentally corrupt whoever performed it. And it means choosing to become the very thing he hates, the abuser rather than the abused, the master rather than the spawn, powerful but monstrous. Most importantly, it means perpetuating the cycle that Veliath began and Cazador continued. The ascension represents not breaking free from Cazador's shadow, but stepping directly into it, becoming the next iteration of a pattern of abuse that stretches back through generations. Astarion would have his revenge and his power, but he would lose himself in the process, becoming something that wears his face but is no longer truly him, corrupted by the magnitude of evil required to achieve ascension. The player's influence at this moment is critical. Throughout the journey, the player has modeled certain values and approaches. If they have consistently encouraged power and ruthlessness, Astarion is more inclined toward ascension. If they have modeled compassion and mercy, demonstrated that strength can exist alongside kindness, shown that there are things more important than power, Astarion is more open to rejecting the ritual, despite the vulnerability that choice entails. The player can attempt to persuade Astarion one way or the other through dialogue, and his response depends on the relationship they have built and the lessons he has learned throughout their journey. If Astarion chooses to complete the ritual and ascend, the transformation is immediate and dramatic. He uses the tadpole connection to copy the infernal scars onto Cazador's back, making Cazador one of the 7 sacrifices. He then activates the ritual, speaking the words in infernal, channeling the dark power of the ceremony. The 7 spawn, including Cazador, are consumed first, their souls ripped from their bodies in agony. Then the cascade begins, spreading through the pyramid structure to consume all 7,000 souls, bound through the 7 key spawn to Cazador, and now to Astarion. The chamber fills with dark energy, souls screaming as they are destroyed, and their essence channeled into Astarion, transforming him in the process. When the ritual completes, Astarion emerges as a vampire ascendant. The power is intoxicating, overwhelming, more than he imagined possible. He can feel that the sun's light will no longer burn him, that he is freed from all traditional vampiric weaknesses, that his magical and physical abilities have been magnified enormously. He has become something close to a god, powerful beyond measure, invulnerable to the threats that once terrified him. He has achieved the ultimate revenge against Cazador, using the vampire lord's own ritual to destroy him and steal the power he sought. But the cost is immediately apparent in who he becomes. The Astarion who ascends is not the Astarion who faced Cazador. The ritual consumes not just the 7,000 souls, but something essential in Astarion himself. The capacity for genuine connection that had been slowly rebuilding during his time with the party withers and dies, burned away by the magnitude of evil he has committed. He becomes cruel in ways that go beyond defense mechanisms or survival strategies. There is a fundamental coldness to him now, a lack of empathy that mirrors Cazador at his worst. He views others as beneath him, as tools or playthings, with the same contempt Cazador showed. The trauma he suffered does not heal, but metastasizes into a new form, transforming him from victim into victimizer. The game makes clear through his dialogue and behavior that this is not a good ending for Astarion, regardless of the power gained. He is no longer capable of genuine love, no longer able to form real connections, no longer growing or healing, but frozen in a state of powerful corruption. If the player character was in a relationship with him, that relationship becomes twisted, with ascended Astarion viewing them more as a possession than a partner, someone to control and dominate rather than someone to share life with. He even offers to turn the player character into his spawn, giving them eternal life but binding them to him as Cazador bound him, perpetuating the cycle in the most literal way possible. The freedom he sought has been achieved, but at the cost of becoming someone who does not deserve freedom, someone who will use it to hurt others as he was hurt. It is a tragedy, the final victory of Cazador's abuse, turning the victim into a new abuser and calling it transcendence. If Astarion chooses to reject the ritual, the decision is equally dramatic, but in an entirely different way. This requires him to turn away from the solution to all his problems, to accept continued vulnerability rather than becoming a monster. The player can help him reach this decision through persuasion or insight checks, appealing to the person he has become during their journey together, reminding him of the connections he has formed, arguing that some prices are too high to pay even for safety. If successful, Astarion steps back from the ritual, recognizing that completing it would destroy him in ways that matter more than physical vulnerability. With Cazador defeated and the ritual rejected, Astarion must decide what to do with his former master. The vampire lord is at his mercy now, the absolute power dynamic reversed, and Astarion has the opportunity to end Cazador permanently. This killing is not the ritual, not the mass sacrifice of 7,000 souls, but the destruction of one incredibly evil being who has caused immeasurable suffering and would certainly continue to do so if allowed to survive. Killing Cazador is justice, revenge, and practical necessity all at once, and there is no moral ambiguity in ending him. Astarion takes up a weapon, often the very dagger Cazador used to carve the infernal scars into his back, and he stabs his former master repeatedly, releasing 2 centuries of rage, pain, and helpless fury. The act of destroying Cazador is cathartic, but also complex emotionally. This is the being who defined Astarion's existence for 200 years, the source of his trauma, the focus of his hatred and fear. Ending Cazador should feel like pure triumph, but it is tinged with other emotions: grief for the time lost, rage at what was done, and perhaps a strange emptiness because the all-consuming focus on Cazador is suddenly gone, leaving Astarion to figure out who he is when not defined by his relationship to his abuser. After Cazador is destroyed, Astarion often breaks down, falling to his knees and sobbing. This moment of vulnerability, of allowing himself to feel the weight of everything he has endured and everything he has just accomplished, represents a breakthrough. For someone who has used sarcasm and cruelty as armor for 2 centuries, who has suppressed his emotions to survive, this raw display of genuine feeling is profound. He is finally, truly free. Cazador is dead. The ritual will not be completed. The threat is ended, and Astarion has proven to himself that he can make the harder choice, that he can value something beyond power, that he is not damned to become what traumatized him. With Cazador destroyed and the ritual rejected, the 6 other spawn are freed from their positions in the ritual chamber. They are still vampire spawn, still bearing the infernal scars, still facing many of the same limitations and challenges Astarion faces, but they are free from Cazador's direct control. Astarion must then decide what to do about the 7,000 spawn that exist throughout the city and beyond, the spawn that were created through the pyramid structure. These spawn are now masterless, freed from the compulsion that bound them, but they are still vampire spawn with all the dangers and limitations that entails. The game offers different options for dealing with these spawn. Astarion can choose to release them into the Underdark, giving them a chance to find their own way in the vast underground realm where darkness reigns, and they might learn to survive without preying on surface dwellers. He instructs his 6 fellow spawn from Cazador's palace to look after them, to try to ensure they do not simply become new threats to innocence. Or, more grimly, he can choose to leave them sealed in the ritual chamber, trapped in darkness and hunger forever, a fate that mirrors his own punishment in the kennels, but extended to thousands. This choice reveals much about who Astarion has become, whether he extends to others the mercy he himself received, or whether he decides that the world is better off with these spawn imprisoned forever. The choice to reject ascension and kill Cazador rather than becoming him, is presented as the good ending for Astarion's personal quest. He remains vulnerable, yes, still needs blood to survive, still bears scars physical and psychological that may never fully heal. The tadpole will eventually be dealt with one way or another through the game's main quest, and when it is removed, Astarion will lose the immunity to sunlight it provided. This means he will return to being unable to walk in daylight, a cruel reminder that some consequences of what Cazador did cannot be undone, that recovery does not mean returning to an unmarked state. But Astarion remains himself. He retains his capacity for growth and connection, has proven that he can choose to be better than his trauma might have made him, has demonstrated that he values things beyond power and safety. He has faced the source of his suffering and emerged victorious, not by becoming it, but by refusing to let it define him absolutely. He has broken the cycle that Velioth began, and Cazador continued. The future is uncertain, and he still faces challenges, but he faces them as himself, rather than as a corrupted shadow of who he once was. The aftermath of this confrontation leaves Astarion in a place of genuine but bittersweet freedom. Cazador is gone. The threat of being dragged back into slavery is eliminated, and while challenges remain, they are challenges he faces as a free person, rather than as property. The journey toward healing is not complete, will likely never be complete in any final sense, but it can continue. He has proven to himself and others that he is more than what was done to him, that he can make choices based on who he wants to be, rather than just on fear and survival, that redemption after profound trauma is difficult and ongoing, but possible. As we reach the end of this comprehensive exploration of Astarion's story, it is worth reflecting on what makes this particular narrative so compelling, so memorable, so impactful that it has resonated with millions of players worldwide and become a cultural touchstone within gaming and beyond. Astarion Ancunín, the vampire spawn who spent over 200 years in torment before finding unexpected freedom, represents something more than just a well-written video game character. His story touches on fundamental aspects of the human experience, explores themes that matter to real people facing real struggles, and does so with a depth, nuance, and emotional honesty that elevates it beyond mere entertainment. The legacy of Astarion's character within Baldur's Gate 3 itself is already assured. He is consistently one of the game's most popular companions, ranking at or near the top in polls about favorite characters and most romanced companions. His personal quest is widely regarded as one of the game's strongest narrative arcs, with the confrontation with Cazador and the choice regarding ascension being highlighted as emotionally powerful and thematically rich moments. The romance with Astarion is one of the most developed and meaningful in the game, offering players the opportunity to be part of his healing journey in intimate ways that feel genuine and impactful. From a pure game design perspective, Astarion is a triumph, a character who enhances the overall experience, provides meaningful choices with real consequences, and rewards player investment with emotional payoff. But Astarion's impact extends far beyond just being a well-designed game character. His story has resonated deeply with survivors of abuse and trauma who see reflections of their own experiences in his journey. The way the game portrays complex trauma, with all its messy effects and difficult recovery, has been validating for many players who have felt their own experiences were not represented or understood in media. Astarion's struggle with trust, vulnerability, and learning to connect authentically after prolonged abuse mirrors struggles many real people face. The fact that the game takes these struggles seriously, presents them with nuance and respect, and offers the possibility, however difficult, of healing, has been profoundly meaningful to countless players who have reached out to express how much the character and his story have meant to them. The discussions that Astarion's character has sparked about trauma, power, consent, and recovery represent a positive cultural impact. Players debate the ethics of the Ascension choice in forums and social media, discussing what genuine consent looks like for someone with Astarion's history, exploring questions about responsibility and redemption for people who have both suffered and caused harm. These conversations, taking place in gaming communities, on social media platforms, in video essays, and even in academic spaces, demonstrate how well-crafted fictional narratives can serve as vehicles for exploring complex, real-world issues. Astarion's story creates a framework for discussing difficult topics, using the distance of fantasy and the supernatural to approach themes that might be too raw or difficult to engage with directly. The performance of Neil Newbin as Astarion deserves special recognition in any discussion of the character's legacy and impact. Voice acting in games is often underappreciated compared to other forms of performance, but Newbon's work brings tremendous depth and humanity to Astarion. The performance captures every layer of the character, the sardonic humor that serves as armor against vulnerability, the moments where pain breaks through the carefully maintained facade, the gradual softening as genuine connections form, the vulnerability in moments of trust, the rage and fear when confronting Cazador, the complex mix of emotions when facing the choice of ascension. It is a masterful performance that transforms what could have been a one-dimensional character into someone who feels real, complex, and deeply human, despite being undead. The performance won the Best Performance Award at the Game Awards 2023. Recognition that was well-deserved and indicative of the character's broader cultural impact. Astarion has also become a phenomenon in fan-creative communities. Fan art depicting him numbers in the tens of thousands of pieces across platforms like Twitter, Tumblr, and DeviantArt, ranging from beautiful illustrations to comics exploring his character, to animations bringing scenes to life. Fan fiction exploring his story, his relationships, alternative outcomes, and expanded narratives exists in vast quantities across multiple platforms, including Archive of Our Own and other fan fiction sites. Cosplayers have created elaborate costumes, recreating his appearance, attending conventions, and sharing their interpretations online. This level of fan engagement demonstrates the character's cultural penetration and the emotional investment players feel toward him. When people are moved to create art inspired by a character, to spend hours crafting costumes or writing stories or creating fan content, it indicates that the character has touched something meaningful in them, has resonated at a level that inspires creative expression. The character has also influenced discussions about representation in gaming, particularly regarding male characters and trauma. Astarion's story includes themes of sexual exploitation and abuse, subjects often handled poorly in games or relegated primarily to female characters. The fact that a male character's sexual trauma is treated with such seriousness and depth is relatively unusual in gaming, where trauma, particularly sexual trauma, is often either not addressed for male characters or treated less seriously when it is. Astarion's story takes his trauma seriously, allows him to be vulnerable and damaged without diminishing his character, presents his potential healing as meaningful character development rather than something to rush past. This representation has been meaningful to many players, particularly male survivors of abuse, who rarely see their experiences reflected in media, and it challenges problematic assumptions about gendered experiences of trauma. From a pure storytelling perspective, Astarion's arc demonstrates several important principles of compelling character writing that could serve as lessons for writers in any medium. His past is not just backstory, but actively influences his present behavior in understandable ways. Every aspect of his personality can be traced to specific experiences and circumstances, creating internal consistency and coherence. He has agency and makes meaningful choices despite his trauma, avoiding the trap of reducing traumatized characters to passive victims without will of their own. His arc offers the possibility of growth and change without suggesting that healing is easy, quick, or complete, presenting a realistic view of recovery as an ongoing process. He is allowed to be imperfect, flawed, sometimes unlikable in his choices and behaviors, without becoming irredeemable or losing player sympathy, striking a difficult balance that makes him feel authentic. The integration of Astarion's personal story with the larger narrative of Baldur's Gate 3 also deserves recognition. His quest is not disconnected from the main plot, but ties into the game's larger themes of power, corruption, freedom, and the choices that define us. The rite of profane ascension parallels the game's overall narrative about godlike power and the costs of obtaining it. Astarion's relationship with the tadpole mirrors the party's larger struggle with the parasites and the choice of whether to embrace or resist the powers they offer. His journey from slavery to freedom reflects the game's broader themes about autonomy and self-determination. This thematic integration makes his story feel essential rather than tangential, a core part of what Baldur's Gate 3 is exploring as a narrative work. Looking at Astarion's place in the broader context of vampire fiction reveals how he represents a particular approach that emphasizes both the horror and the tragedy of vampirism, while still allowing for the possibility of humanity and redemption. He is not a romanticized vampire who sees his condition as a gift or revels in his powers. Neither is he a purely monstrous predator without human qualities or capacity for connection. Instead, he is someone cursed with a condition he did not choose, shaped by abuse into something he does not want to be, struggling to retain or reclaim his humanity in circumstances that make that struggle incredibly difficult. This portrayal of vampirism as curse rather than gift, as something that comes with terrible costs and consequences, feels refreshing and meaningful. Yet, Astarion is not defined solely by being a vampire. He is a person who happens to be undead, whose personhood persists despite and through his monstrous nature. The question of what happens to Astarion after the game's conclusion varies, depending on player choices. But in the good ending, where he rejects ascension, his future remains somewhat uncertain, and that uncertainty feels appropriate and honest. He has defeated Cazador and freed himself from that specific torment, but he remains a vampire spawn with all the limitations that entails. When the tadpole is eventually removed, he loses the immunity to sunlight it provided, meaning he cannot walk in daylight anymore, a loss that is genuinely tragic after he experienced that gift for a brief time. His journey toward healing will continue, difficult and ongoing, for the rest of his undead existence. The game does not promise that everything will be fine, that trauma can be completely overcome, or that choosing to do the right thing guarantees a happy ending in all respects. Instead, it offers the possibility of growth, of connection, of building a life worth living, even while carrying the weight of a terrible past. This honest, unglamorized approach to recovery feels respectful to real survivors, who often face similar uncertainties and ongoing struggles. Healing is not a destination, but a process, not a state achieved once and maintained forever, but something that requires continuous effort and recommitment. Astarion's story acknowledges this reality while still offering hope, showing that while the past cannot be erased and some damage cannot be fully repaired, growth and meaningful change remain possible. Connection with others can be genuine and healing. Choosing to be better than one's trauma tried to make one be is both achievable and worthwhile, even when it is difficult and uncertain. The artistic achievement of Astarion's character, considering writing, performance, design, and integration into the larger game, represents what video games can accomplish as a storytelling medium when given the resources, talent, and commitment to do something meaningful. This is not just entertainment, though it certainly entertains. This is art that explores important themes, that challenges players emotionally and morally, that creates experiences and characters that stay with people long after the game is completed, that can genuinely impact how people understand themselves and others. The fact that a video game can create a character this complex, this emotionally resonant, this culturally impactful, demonstrates the maturation of games as an artistic medium capable of achieving what any great work of literature, film, or other art form can achieve. As we conclude this comprehensive exploration of Astarion's story, from his mortal life as a magistrate in Baldur's Gate through over 200 years of torment to his eventual freedom and the choices that define his future, we can appreciate the full scope of his narrative. This is a story about suffering and survival, about the long shadow trauma casts and the difficult work of healing. It explores the corruption of power and the possibility of redemption. It examines choosing who you will be when circumstances have tried to determine what you must be. It acknowledges the reality of evil, the persistence of trauma, and the difficulty of recovery, while still affirming that choice matters, that agency persists even through terrible circumstances, and that becoming something other than what abuse tried to make you is possible, however hard. Astarion Ancunín, the vampire spawn who survived 2 centuries of hell and emerged damaged but not destroyed, who faced the choice between power and integrity, and could choose either, who represents both the horrors of victimization and the possibility of recovery, has earned his place as one of gaming's most memorable and meaningful characters. His story will continue to resonate with players, to inspire conversations about trauma and healing, to demonstrate what thoughtful, respectful portrayal of difficult subject matter looks like, and to remind us that even in our darkest moments, even when we feel most powerless, even when we have been hurt beyond what seems bearable, the possibility of change, of growth, of choosing to be something better than what tried to break us remains. For those who played Baldur's Gate 3 and traveled with Astarion, who fought beside him, who perhaps loved him, who helped him face his past and choose his future, his story becomes personal in ways that only interactive media can achieve. And for those who have only heard his story told, as it has been told here, in the quiet hours, in the darkness where such stories belong, perhaps something of his journey has resonated, has touched on universal experiences of suffering and survival, has reminded us that the path from victim to survivor, to someone who can choose kindness despite having been shown cruelty, that path exists and can be walked, difficult and uncertain though it may be. This is the complete and accurate story of Astarion, told in full so that the weight of 200 years can be understood, so that the choice between power and redemption can be appreciated in its full context, so that the triumph of choosing integrity over invulnerability, despite everything he suffered, can be recognized for the remarkable act of strength it represents. From the dark street where he died, to the ritual chamber where he chose life over ascension, from the slave who could not control his own actions to the free person who could choose mercy, Astarion's journey is one of the great character arcs in gaming, a story told with intelligence, empathy, and artistry that will endure as an example of what video games can achieve when they dare to tackle difficult subject matter with the seriousness and depth it deserves. Rest now, dear listener, as our tale concludes. Let the story of Astarion accompany you into sleep, a dark lullaby of suffering and redemption, of 200 years compressed into this telling, of a vampire spawn who remained human enough to be saved. In the quiet darkness, may you find the same peace that Astarion seeks, the same possibility of healing after hurt, the same hope that tomorrow can be different from yesterday, that freedom once found can be maintained, and that choosing to be better than what tried to break us is always, always possible. The story is told. The vampire spawn has faced his master and survived. And in the telling, perhaps something meaningful has been shared about the nature of trauma, the corruption of power, the long road to healing, and the choices that define who we are. Sleep well, and may your dreams be kinder than Astarion's 200 years of nightmares. But may you wake with his hard-won understanding that darkness can be survived, that change is possible, and that even after unimaginable suffering, there remains the possibility of something better.